Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. It depends where you are. Dear Geoffrey Players, President of the Forum, dear Hermelio Santos, Head of the Local Organizing Committee, dear Jacob Carlos Lima, President of the Brazilian Sociological Association, dear friends and colleagues of the Forum. It is an immense pleasure to welcome you, sociologists from all over the world, to our fourth ISA Forum of Sociology. Alas, I wish my welcome could be made warmer by our physical encounter in Porto Alegre. We have been long resisted to make the conference a virtual event, but the COVID-19 pandemic has forced us to turn it into a Zoom one. I confess I spent many sleepless nights thinking about the consequences of such a change and worrying about a low turnout. But luckily, we have ended up with 3,300 participants presenting their papers and several hundred attendees. The forum theme proposed in 2018 by Geoffrey Player, the ISA Vice President of Research, was visionary indeed. That being the challenges of the 21st century, democracy, environment, inequalities, intersectionalities. In the last few years, we have been living through times of impossible reasonable debate. Demagogical times are driven by the vertiginous rise of populism and authoritarianism, and with the triumph of Trump and numerous mini Trumps in many places around the globe. Last December, we witnessed a most symbolic, cynical act of this alliance between populism and authoritarianism when French President Emmanuel Macron gave his Egyptian counterpart, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, France's highest award of his state visit to Paris, adding to the controversy over the hugely contentious arms purchase trip. This shows how salient the theme of democratization is today. The environment is also a timely theme, as we are living during an unprecedented global ecological crisis, which is most probably the chief reason behind COVID-19 pandemic. The surreal atmosphere of this pandemic has exposed fault lines in trust among human beings, among countries, and between citizens and governments, and is pushing us to raise important questions about ourselves, our social relationships, value commitments, and life more generally. And this crisis is not just limited to public and environmental health or to the economy. What we are witnessing is a moment of truth regarding the crisis of late modernity and its neoliberal capitalist system on a broad, overarching scale. For instance, with the limited stock of fossil energy and quotas on CO2 emissions, a global transition to a low carbon economy is a necessity, not an option. We are not able to simply revert to business as usual after we get through this crisis. And sociology, along all other disciplines, should work to both analyze and actively engage in addressing these new realities. A fundamental debate about our economic order should be opened. And as Klaus Dor, our co-editor of ISA newsletter Global Dialogue, reminds us, this debate must not be conducted exclusively by economists and career politicians. Should we revive cooperative economy, as the late Eric Wright advocates as a real utopia? Exploring this further, I invite you to listen to presentation tomorrow of Marta Solar, our editor of International Sociology. COVID-19 is a disease not only of globalization, but of Anthropocene. The creed of a human consumerism is depleting resources that our earth cannot renew. And this virus is but one episode of this consumerism. Such voracious consumerism is induced by the mythical access to happiness, which ultimately serves as an effective accelerator for more health troubles, epidemics, death, and disaster. In these few minutes today, I would like to highlight ways to move towards a better post-COVID-19 world. As a sociologist, we need to deal with two problems. One has to do with the logic of sociological analysis, and the other with the scope of sociology as a vocation. Regarding the logic of sociological analysis, the late Australian philosopher Val Plumwood rejected the hyper-separation between self and other, and between humanity and nature. Society and nature are perceived each as differentiated into separate compartments. But the sphere of nature, culture, politics, social, economy, and religion are indeed traversed by common logics that allow a given society to be encompassed in its totality, exactly as Marcel Mauss and Karl Polanyi did. The logic of power and interest embodied in Homo economicus prevents us from being able to see the potentiality of human beings to cultivate gift-giving practices as an anthropological foundation innate within social relationships. Concerning the scope of our vocation as a sociologist, I will go beyond the Weberian conception. The French philosopher Gilles Deleuze argued that the left, and I would say with it most of social scientists, perceives the world in terms of relationship that begin from most distant and move inward. Social inequality, for instance, has been understood as a global phenomenon of exploitation whose relationship can be traced toward imperialism and colonialism. Thus, many social scientists call for addressing the existence of structure of imperialism and colonialism in order to properly address the suffering of the affected abstract social classes. But this just, and I insist, just struggle against the neoliberal order has sometimes eclipsed other struggles located at the bottom. This local level has been invested by identity politics movements such as religious group and right-wing, far right-wing, and conservative ones, which view relationships as beginning from a closer point and move to the most distant. They believe in community work, on family and neighborhood relationships. In Lebanon, for instance, grassroots organizations are currently the most proactive institutions dealing with families who lost their jobs during the lockdown. My proposal for a post-corona sociology is one which is capable of reinventing its traditional emphasis, that being from the outward in, to creating methods that use multi-scale focuses This includes rethinking the importance of the family and community, and the ethics of love, hospitality, and caring, and scaling up to the level of nation state and humanity as a whole. Michael Borrowe has often insisted that the task of sociology is to stand with civil society against both state and market dominations. This is absolutely crucial, but I would add to this task another two. The first one is to extend the sociological mission beyond civil society to the civil sphere, in the sense of Geoffrey Alexander. He reminds us that civil society is only one sphere among others within a broader social system in which the family, religious groups, scientific and corporate associations, and geographically bounded regional communities should be incorporated. And they all produce goods and organize their social relationships according to different ideals and constraints. This extension of our mission is very important if we are to keep looking at ourselves as guardian of this civil sphere and of liberal democratic ideals. The second task, in my sense, is to mediate with different non-civil spheres, engage in dialogue with them, and demand certain kind of reforms. What are the means of mediation? It is carried out basically through providing cognitive validity claims and normative argumentation to the public sphere. But is this sufficient? We know from the brilliant work of Hans Joas on values that we need to account for value commitments of social actors, and this include emotions, which means it is not enough to simply support those who have liberal democratic ideas. We also need to listen attentively to those who refuse to embrace partially or totally these ideas. Let us remember the excellent work of Arlie Russell Hochschild about rural white Americans in Louisiana. They have turned into Trump supporters, expressing their discontent vis-a-vis globalization and their vision of social inequalities. Before judging them, let us listen, for instance, to those who have fears of Syrian and African migrants coming to Europe. With our normative methods, presuppositions, and explicit commitments, I would like here to emphasize our capacity of dialoguing and mediating with non-civil spheres. Against a radical critical social theory, I call for a situated critical one that, while criticizing powers, is also able to simultaneously open up dialogue with the very forces it critiques. For example, we can enter into conflict without slaughtering each other. We all need to remember Paul Ricoeur's aphorism in defining what should be our ethics. That means the aim of living the good life with and for others with just institutions. In other words, the ethics of love, hospitality, solicitude, and care with and for others, which mean practical reason or practical humanity that can be fully expressed in just institutions that ensure social justice and democracy. This convivial way of conceiving our sociology as a vocation is something dear to convivialist sociologists like Alain Caillé from France or Frédéric Vandenberg from Brazil. This convivial way is an invitation for thinking responsibility before freedom, and how to foster and encourage meaningful relationships with our other fellow human beings with modesty and open-mindedness. Avant cogito, il y a un bonjour. Before cogito, there is a hello, said Emmanuel Levinas. But in no way should my focus on the issues of recognition overshadow issues of redistribution, as Nancy Fraser reminded us in her conversation with Axel Honneth. While our sociological endeavor may provide knowledge on poverty, social inequality, or the extent of refugee issues, it should mobilize emotions and moral impulse, compassion, altruism, solidarity, and activism. The aim is to go beyond describing and criticizing social life toward intellectually constructing a framework for society, a society that incorporates all its citizens while respecting all forms of pluralism without pushing the others into assimilation to cultural majoritarianism. Here, I am thinking more particularly of how France deals today with the Muslim problem and how these citizens who refuse to be assimilated provide the French society with a mirror, a crooked, passion-laden mirror in which to see reflection of its own identity and societal problems and its tough conception of secularism, laïcité. While sociology underwent a process of disenchantment, that being the emphasis of rationality and rationalization as part of its professionalization in the late 19th and 20th centuries, it's time to re-enchant it through collaboration with moral social philosophy and other social sciences. Going back to our forum, from the abstract I read by the panel contributors from our 58 research committees and working and thematic groups, I am confident that we will witness moments of high intellectual quality. But unfortunately, without the lively, convivial Latino ambience of the forum in the city of the Porto Alegre. This forum, in fact, would not have been possible without the amazing and patient work of Geoffrey PLEYERS, the research coordinating committees, and the local organizing committee headed by Hermilio Santos, and of course, the ISA secretary in Madrid. I mean, I'm thinking particularly to Isabella working until last minutes on this. So far, 2021 has certainly not lived up to our wishes for this new year. We are currently experiencing one of the most disruptive pandemics in modern history, with 107 million confirmed cases and more than 2.5 million deaths globally. Against this background, the ISA seeks to pursue its mission, working with the international sociological community through the pandemic-induced switch to online teaching and lecturing. We are trying to turn these predicaments into assets, including through democratization, the participation in scientific events, through the possibility of reaching scholarly community that cannot afford to travel, and by reducing sociology's carbon footprint caused by air travel. Let us hope that the post-COVID-19 era will strike a better balance between knowledge accessibility, climate change mitigation, conviviality, and networking. Finally, let me give you again my warmest virtual welcome to the forum And I hope to see you all in person in our next 20 ISA World Congress of Sociology in Melbourne, Australia, from July 24 to 30 next year. Thank you so much. And I give the floor now to Geoffrey PLEYERS. You have the floor, Geoffrey.
Many thanks, Sari. Many thanks, Mr. President of the ISA. It's well, today we, as Sari just reminded us, we are in such circumstances of the pandemic. But the COVID-19 pandemic has stressed how deeply interdependent we have become. And in that, fostering a global dialogue among social scientists from all continents is the core mission of the ISA, and even more important today. So we are gathering social scientists from all continents and share their vision of research, and the research results is our core mission, and it's even more important today. Sociologists and social scientists have played a crucial role in dealing with the pandemic and analyzing its impacts. I would like to point out 4 major sets of contribution by social scientists that have changed the way we see the pandemic, and that will be at the core of many panels of this forum. First, sociologists have shown that the pandemic is not only a sanitary crisis, it is also and foremost a social phenomenon. While the virus is a biological entity that may infect any human body, the pandemic is a social fact that affects us differently and exacerbates social inequalities, notably in terms of class, race, and gender. This fact was established by social scientists and has dramatically changed the way we see the pandemic. Social scientists have unveiled the inequality gap, showing that African Americans were twice more infected by the virus than white Americans. Social scientists have shown that if many consider that Africa or some Indian states are less affected by the virus, it is above all because these populations remain invisible in national statistics and too often don't have enough medical doctors to report the pandemic. In too many cases, the actors that suffer most of the pandemic are little visible, or to put it in Boaventura's or SANTOS words, they are invisibilized, which means actively produced as invisible. They were not visible in most media accounts, and they were not taken into account in public policies against the pandemic that are planned by and for people from the middle class upwards. The pandemic is a global event that intersects with the daily life of each human being on the planet, but at the same time, we face it with unequal resources. This is a key contribution of social science over the last year. A second set of contributions focuses on how people experience the pandemic and the lockdown. The pandemic being a global phenomenon, the temptation is high to limit ourselves to micro-analysis, collecting statistics, analyzing national policies. All of this is important. However, it is also crucial to uncover the existential dimensions of the pandemic. These dimensions cannot be understood only in terms of public health and economic statistics. The experience of the pandemic in all realms of life has been the focus of major contributions in all fields of research covered by our 67 ISA research committees. Digital technologies have reshaped many realms of life, from work to family. They have paved the way to the infodemic, the spread of false news, but also to share practices of solidarity. They have transformed our way to connect with family and friends, as well as our way of teaching. And of course, here we are, our way of meeting in international forums. The pandemic, the confinement, and the fear of contagion have had a deep impacts on the daily life and on the subjectivity of billions of people. They have revealed our vulnerability as a biological, human, social, and spiritual beings. What impacts will it have on our children who are growing up in a world where social distancing seems to be the new normal? The fear of the virus has also led to the rise of racism that has been documented in everywhere in the world. On the other side, sociologists have also studied the way solidarity initiatives and mutual aid have transformed the way people live in their neighborhood and experience the pandemic. And once we show that the experience of the pandemic cannot be understood only in terms of public health and economic statistics, we also assert that solutions to this pandemic cannot be formulated only in terms of public health, economic, or political terms. A third stream of social science research has analyzed the way policymakers and political regimes have dealt with the pandemic. The pandemic has revealed the strengths and weaknesses of governments, public policies, and political regimes. It has transformed the relationship between citizens and their governments. It has shown the importance of public healthcare systems. In the past years, nation states have imposed themselves as the main actors in dealing with the pandemic. Each government has set its necropolitics, focusing on protecting a smaller or a larger part of its population, while giving less support to others, such as informal workers or elderly people in care homes that were even not taken into account in national statistics in the first outbreak. All over the world, we witness a comeback of the state as a central actor. However, we still have to raise the question, which state is back? Is it a welfare state able to protect its citizens? Is it a state that promotes and funds its transnational corporations in a global competition? Or are we witnessing the rise of a new authoritarian era that Sari referred to, with biopolitics grounded in new technologies? In many countries, the virus has been used as a pretext to crush dissent, to criminalize civil rights, and to silence social movements. A fourth stream of research has focused on how society is produced and transformed by the pandemic. We have to avoid simplistic view of social change. The crisis in itself does not determine the direction of social change. The pandemic may plea for stronger welfare states and a more equal world. It seems obvious to many of us, but the outcomes may also be very different. The way humanity will get out of the pandemic will rely on how policymakers, economic actors, citizens, and social movements impose their interpretations of the crisis and set the ground for new policies in economic, social, and democratic matters. We need thus to study the ongoing battle between progressive, reactionary, and capitalist actors to define the meaning of the pandemic and shape the world that will come out of it. A fifth and last stream of research points to epistemic challenges forced by the pandemic. While sociology has contributed to shape the meaning of the pandemic as a social phenomenon, the pandemic has also challenged sociology and its meaning. In many ways, the pandemic is an invitation to revisit some key epistemological questions. For instance, our relationship with the actors who confront the pandemic. In previous points, I have stressed that we cannot understand the impacts of the pandemic without paying a closer attention to the oppressions suffered by subaltern actors who remain little visible but are most affected by the pandemic. Their experience has to be unveiled. A second step is to unveil also the practices developed by these actors to tackle the pandemic and to visibilize practical solutions from the grassroots. Can you imagine Dalit women farmers from South India once facing hunger and now contributing with 20 tons of food grains for COVID-19 relief actions? This is the kind of stories that Ashish Kotari brings together and on which he builds his global perspective. All over the world, women and even more women of color and indigenous women are at the front line of the battle against the pandemic in our hospitals, our families, and our communities. And Rita SEGATO will tell us more about them. All over the world, indigenous people have set up practices based on communal approaches of health and not individualized approach of health. We also need to visibilize the importance of solidarity economy as a solution to the social and economic crisis raised by the pandemic, as Jean-Louis Laville will do. Taking into account the way grassroots actors face the pandemic is crucial. They show us that it is not true that the states and the markets are the only actors that confront this pandemic. A third and indispensable step is required to take into account the actors who confront the pandemic from below. It is an epistemological step. These actors are not only producers of practices, they are also producers of knowledge and of insightful epistemologies, as Boa, Rita, Ashish, and Jean-Louis will show us. These actors renew critical stances on democracy, inequality, and ecology. These actors produce new world visions we need to listen to when we analyze the pandemic and the challenges we face. The perspective of care, formulated by feminist activists and individuals, has revealed crucial to understand the resilience of communities and families in the pandemic and to rethink society on a different basis. The intersectional perspective leads to revisiting the democratic challenges, social justice, and environmental justice. Indigenous people have safeguarded holistic approaches that stress the connections between social, ecological, and sanitary dimensions of this crisis. They see the pandemic as an illustration of a broader crisis, a crisis of civilization, that points to the urgent need to rethink our relationship with nature. Well, this argument is exactly the perspective now adopted and diffused by leading social scientists such as Arturo Escobar in Latin America and Bruno Latour in Europe. So what we are witnessing is a deep reconfiguration of social theories that is rooted in the experience and worldviews of emancipatory movements from below. Hence, the epistemologies of the South, feminist, indigenous, and intersectional perspectives on democracy, ecology, and social justice are far more than alternative options for sociology in the 21st century. They are at its core and have deeply transformed it. This is not only about democratizing the production of knowledge, this is also about better knowledge, a deep understanding of the common challenges we face and of some alternative solutions to confront them. And the ISA is one of the spaces where this reconfiguration of social sciences is happening and where it treats a different global sociology. Following Michael Bauboy, the ISA has committed itself to promote a public sociology. We need to renew this commitment, as Sari just did in a very smart way. We also have to deepen it, addressing our sociological analysis to citizens and civil society, and I would add with Sari the civil sphere. This is important. But we have to take one more step to embrace a sociology with the actors in the perspective of a co-production of knowledge that is better able to grasp the challenges we face in the pandemic and some path to get out of it. For Latin American sociologists, this approach is far from new. Orlando Fazbora, Paulo Freire, and many others have developed it for 50 years. We have much to learn from them, and we need to integrate them and many other scholars from the Global South in the international canon of our discipline. Likewise, a renewed global sociology requires unveiling the legacy of those who have been invisibilized by the modern, white, and male-dominated sociological canon. We need to stress, for instance, the importance of Du Bois in American and global sociology, as Michael Borroway will do in our closing plenary. This dialogue among sociologists from different continents and different backgrounds is crucial to renew our discipline. And the ISA is the place where this is happening. The ISA is our tool to promote this intercultural and intercontinental dialogue and to put it at the core of a renewed global sociology. The ISA is our tool to promote a global sociology that does not see the world only from above, from the plains, but is rooted in a dialogue with scholars and actors from all continents in a project of co-production of knowledge. It is thus crucial to shed light on world visions and critical perspectives produced by actors who confront not only the pandemic, but also patriarchy, capitalism, and racism. Unveiling epistemic and social injustices doesn't come without risk, setbacks, and counter-movements. Around the world, sociologists are threatened, jailed, and sometimes murdered. The freedom of research is threatened in an increasing number of countries, not only in authoritarian regimes, but also in countries that seemed solid democracies just a few years ago, such as India or Brazil. And in 2021, it would probably be impossible to have this conference in France, where the government has just ruled that using a concept such as intersectionality makes you an adversary of the French Republic and an intellectual complicit with Islamic terror attack. The fact that this is happening with the government of France In a country that claims to have invented human rights, it reminds us that democracy and academic freedom should never be taken for granted and that we should stand up for it. However, in spite of these setbacks and oppositions, the decolonization of a renewed global sociology is on the way. For sure, there is still a long way to go for the ISA, notably when it comes to supporting and implementing a free circulation of knowledge. However, I'm proud to open a forum of a global association that is presided by a Palestinian sociologist who grew up in a refugee camp and now contributes to a global dialogue as an Arab and a global scholar. I'm honored to preside over a forum that will have, for the first time in the history of the ISA, a feminist sociologist from Mozambique in our closing plenary, and a Nepali sociologist in one of our common sessions. It will gather sociologists from 125 countries. And I'm eager to listen to our colleagues and the representatives from Latin American Sociological Association, ALAS, from CLACSO, from CODESRIA, from the African Council of Social Sciences, from the Arab Council of Social Sciences, and from our partner of the Brazilian Sociological Society that all have joined us in this forum. Now, organizing a virtual forum represented a huge challenge and a hard work for our efficient ISA secretariat that I would really like to thank. I would also like to mention the work of our Vice President for Finance, Sawako Shirahaze, of the Porto Alegre Local Organizing Committee and its chair, Emilio Santos, of our Vice President for Publications, Elusa Martin, that has set up panels to give you an opportunity to meet the ISA journal editors, and our Vice President for National Associations, Guin Gutierrez, that has prepared a video series with inspiring senior sociologists from all continents. But this forum would not exist without the dedication and largely invisible organizing work by the presidents and program coordinators of the 62 research committees, working groups and thematic groups that participate in this forum and are the vibrant heart of our International Sociological Association. This forum is first and foremost their achievement. This forum will also be the opportunity for us, for our community, to pay tribute to three of our most distinguished colleagues in three dedicated panels. Eric Orin-Wright on Wednesday evening, Emmanuel Wallenstein, former ISA president, on Thursday noon, and Marielle Franco on Thursday evening. Marielle Franco, a Brazilian sociologist, was murdered on March 14, 2018. Her life testified that intersectionality is not only a theoretical concept, it is a daily experience for millions of citizens around the world that suffer constant discriminations and violence because of their race, gender, sexual orientation, or just for being poor. She has become a global symbol of a struggle against racism, colonialism, and heteropatriarchy, and against police violence. Her murderers, however, did not impede her to join us today. Like through this short video, I would like to welcome Marielle Franco as the first keynote speaker of this fourth ISA forum.
A Mari na internet. Eu conheci ela no cinema.
Conheci ela no início de 2015, no debate sobre racismo e encarceramento.
Eu conheci Mari na época das eleições, né?
A gente estava fazendo uma atividade do feminismo do Rio de Janeiro. Eu sentia muito orgulho quando ela dizia que eu era uma amiga que ela tinha ganhado na Mari. Era uma pessoa que incomodava, né?
Mulher, negra, favelada, mãe de adolescente, com uma companheira, com o debate da bissexualidade, com as referências nessa cidade que quer falar de urbana e ainda fala de direitos humanos, gente.
Eu nasci no Conjunto Esperança. Aos 15 eu venho mais pro lado da Baixa. Logo na sequência, eu brinco com alguns amigos que eu fugia muitas das vezes da época do Crisma para ir pro baile. Eu sou funkeira e me reivindico como funkeira.
Eu fui dançarina furacão, da que o funk começou a tocar. Porque se é esse lugar do afeto...
E saía com as galeras, vinha pra cá, Nova Holanda, saía de lá do morro, curti baile de galera, como eu curti torcida organizada, porque acho que quem nunca foi na geral do Maracanã junto com torcida organizada não entende o que são os geraldinos, não entende o que é gostar de futebol.
Sou da Maré, acho que mulheres negras são subrepresentadas na política, esse é o nosso espaço, é a gente que sente a cidade diferente, com o horário do transporte, com o local dos transportes, com o debate da cultura, tem vários acessos que a gente precisa ter e essa redução da desigualdade é fundamental.
Fazer essa disputa é fazer essa disputa pelo campo de gênero, é fazer pela centralidade das mulheres, é fazer olhando... Por exemplo, como que essa violência nos adoece? Quais são as mães que estão hoje preocupadas se seu filho saiu para o trabalho ou não?
O Brasil é um país onde o jovem negro ou morre com farda ou sem farda. Porque a própria PM que mata todo dia também é preta.
Não tem que arrombar garagem. Não tem que dizer que, como a gente já ouviu, há 2 horas e eu não matei ninguém. Isso de um agente da segurança pública.
Ou essa sociedade muda a estrutura a partir de nós, e aí objetivamente uma sobe e puxa a outra, ou essa revolução será a partir das mulheres negras ou ela não será.
Mas eu quero realmente que a gente pense aonde que meu povo vai estar daqui a uns anos. Precisa estar vivo.
Marielle, presente. Marielle, presente.
Marielle, presente.
Marielle, presente. Marielle, presente. Marielle, presente.
Marielle, presente.
Marielle, presente.
Marielle, presente.
Marielle, presente.
É isso, vamos que vamos. Eu sou porque nós somos, porque nossos passos vêm, de longe, porque a gente resiste. Eu sou favela porque nós somos resistência.
Eu sou porque ela é. Ela é importante. A Mari vai ser importante sempre. Sempre.
Marielle presente.
Marielle presente.
Marielle presente.
Ele presente.
So after this video and Marielle that symbolically opened our forum, it will be difficult for our next speaker here, but we are staying in Brazil. And I would like to thank Jacob Carlos Lima, the president of the Brazilian Sociological Society, for being with us today, unfortunately not in Brazil, in Porto Alegre, and to leave him the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone. I greet you, Sari Hanafi, ISA President, PLEYERS from Forum President, and the colleagues that shared this session. In 2017, the Brazilian Sociological Society, SBS, completes 70 years of existence. Founded in 1937 as the Paulista Society of Sociology, it was only effectively organized as the Brazilian Sociological Society in 1950, joining the newly founded International Sociological Association. The period from 1937 to 2017 was not continuous due to the political and organizational features of a small professional category, which are almost exclusively linked to the university. Thus, after its reorganization in 1950, it's held in 1954 the first Brazilian Congress of Sociology in the city of São Paulo, the second meeting happening 8 years later in 1962. With the military coup of 1964, sociology was hit hard with the compulsory retirement of numerous university professors and research. It was only reorganized after democratization of the country in 1985, holding its the third Congress in Brasilia in 1987. Since then, it was a regular existence with biannual Congress. The 20th Congress will be next July in Belém, but also online. The erratic trajectory of the SBS in the earliest decades was accompanied by the establishment of the first undergraduate courses in sociology and politics or social science, which began in 1933 in the city of São Paulo until 1964. 19 additional courses are founded in different regions of the country, as well the 2 graduate courses also in São Paulo. During this period, sociological production grew as well as the defense of the scientificity. However, research was still restricted mainly to São Paulo. The military dictatorship and its concern regarding scientific and technological autonomy inadvertently contributed to the expansion of sociology and the social science. The structuration of a research and postgraduate system led to the expansion of undergraduate and graduate education throughout the country, which was responsible in the 1970s for the emergence of the other social science associations and conferences, allowing the diffusion of scientific knowledge. After democratization, this expansion was boosted by an increase of incentive policies that enable the consolidation of sociology as a field. Internationalization accompanied this expansion, with Brazilian sociology standing out worldwide. Starting in 2006, the discipline became compulsory in high school, expanding the labor market for sociologists. It's important to stress that this labor market is mainly found in superior and high school education. In the other sector, it is almost invisibility, since for the most part of sociologists is employed as social and planning technician in public institutions, NGOs, and private companies in functions which are shared with graduates from the other humanities. These achievements, however, have been threatened since the so-called parliamentary coup of 2016. Sociology has become a target of rulers who have come to question its usefulness and relevance, whether in universities or high schools, its access to research funds, and more. Recently, it was accused of preaching an obscure cultural Marxism that would be threatening the Brazilian family. These attacks are on the rise with worrying results, and sociology is not alone in this trench. In 2017, there was a hasty reform of high school in which sociology became an optional discipline, as did philosophy. The extreme right-wing government that took office in 2019 attacked it, saying that the public university should prioritize useful courses, and the ones who wanted to study sociology and philosophy should attend private universities. Philosophy and sociology students represent less than 3% of the public university students. The attacks progressed and now are more generic, stating that public university is a useless, expensive, and the locus of resistance from the political opposition. The SBS, along with the other social science professionals, having joined efforts to resist these policies of dismantling the country's public structures in the name of fiscal adjustment. Since the 1990s, such policies have resulted in social and political disaster in most countries where they were applied. Currently, during the pandemic, the situation is even worse because the policies tend to continually dismantle the institutions and social policies. In these scenarios, holding the four ICA Forum in Brazil, evento online, represents an additional space for resistance, not only for sociological knowledge, but for the fight of knowledge against barbarism. This is accompanied by a narrow religion fundamentalism and an authoritarianism that has the complicity of institutions of the Republic that were supposed to defend democracy, but that apparently do not have much convictions about it. Welcome to all. We are together in the struggle of freedom, democracy, and social justice. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Jacob, and I'm really glad that we can be virtually in Brazil and working together with the Brazilian society. We also, the local organizing committee and Emilio Santos also prepared a series of videos about the challenges of sociology in the Brazilian society that will be available online very soon on the website.
You are.
And so with that,
I lost it too.
We will
about the videos. Emilio remember me, but I lost. Sorry.
With that, I will close now the first part. That was the first part of the inauguration session to now to the opening ceremony, and now give open a second part, which is the opening panels. As usually, it's much clearer because we are all together in the same room, but this time we had to do it both all together in this online Zoom system. And so I would like to welcome our four speakers of this opening panel, opening plenary. And the COVID-19 pandemic has stressed how deeply interdependent we have become, as we all said. Fostering a global dialogue among social scientists from all continents is our common mission. And in that, there are few scholars as experienced as Boaventura, so SANTOS, Rita SEGATO, Ashish Kotari, and Jean-Louis. And these four speakers, as well as the speakers of our closing plenary, embody a global sociology rooted in a constant dialogue with actors and social movements. There's also someone we invited here and that was so important to this forum, Maricela Svampa. She should have been with us today, and but she's one of the most insightful global sociologists from Latin America. Unfortunately, she's going through a difficult time, and we'd just like to tell her, if she listened to us, that we share her grief and send her our friendship. The four speakers today depict a shared vision of a global dialogue between different continents and deeply rooted in the global south. The first of them is Boaventura Santos, a professor of sociology at the University of Coimbra in Portugal and a distinguished professor at the Institute for Legal Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's the author of countless books, over 30, translated into numerous languages on legal sociology, the global left, the epistemologies of the South, and social theories. His latest book in English is The End of the Cognitive Empire, the coming of age of epistemologies of the South. In January 2001, 20,000 activists and public intellectuals from all continents gathered in Porto Alegre for the first World Social Forum. 20 years ago, I witnessed Boaventura as one of the leading actors of this process. 20 years later, he will open another World Forum, this time of sociology, that should also have happened in the city of Porto Alegre and actually on the very same campus. I'm happy and honored to welcome Professor Boaventura de Santo in this opening panel of the 4th ISA Forum of Sociology. The floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you are. Thank you, Geoffrey, for this wonderful introduction, for this marvelous video on Marielle Franco. It's a great honor for me to come after her, as well as before my colleagues, Rita SEGATO, Ashish, Jean-Louis. My best to Sari, which I salute here, and also to Jacob Carlos Lima. And my thoughts are also, for reasons that we know, with my dear friend Maristela Svampa. Well, the topic of my presentation changed because of the pandemic, because I've been doing research and writing, as many of us as we should, as sociologists of our time, and I have come to the conclusion that the pandemic is the beginning of the 21st century. I think that we have other crises already in the 21st century, but as Eric Hobsbawm told us, in fact, the centuries never begin on the first day of the first year of the century. They start with some crisis event that changes life world in the following decades. Well, the Industrial Revolution, 1830s is the beginning of the 19th century, and the First World War and the Russian Revolution are the beginning of the 20th century. They inscribe themselves into our lives. And I think there were already two crises, 9/11, 2001, and the global financial crisis, 2008. But I think this crisis is really of a different kind, not just because it's global, because the financial crisis was also a global crisis, is because it is going to change our life, I'm convinced. I don't think that we'll get rid of this pandemic very soon. In fact, I'm claiming that we are entering a period of intermittent pandemic. So we'll go on for many decades, in spite of vaccines, in spite of anything, always very much concerned with this kind of virus, because they are a signal of the disaster to which the model of capitalist development has brought us here. Because we know that climate change, global ecological crisis are at the core of the recurrence of these new pandemics, because of the destabilizing effect of this production on the life worlds of the wild animals and nature. And of course, we know that contaminating rivers, burning down the forest, rainforests, open pit mining, all of this is destroying our planet. And Mother Earth is sending us a message, a very cruel one, because it's a message that consists in killing the most vulnerable ones with this pandemic. So I think it's very important to bear this in mind. I think that the pandemic, for us sociologists, offers some very contrasting images, which are in a sense a challenge, make that our society at the beginning of the 21st century is very challenging and intriguing to study. Let's just mention two or three features of these contrasting images. For instance, the contrasting image between the fragility of human life and the strength, technological strength of our times. So on one side, the pandemic has shown the immense fragility of human beings. Even the most developed country in the world, the USA, cannot defend itself from the invasion of this nano-sized type of virus. So you are very much defenseless. It shows a fragility, a tremendous fragility. But it comes on the eve of the fourth industrial revolution, of the artificial intelligence, of robotics, of Internet of Things, of three-dimension printing. That is to say, of things that signal a technological strength that you can dominate almost everything. And now probably better than at the Fourier time, in the 19th century, we can transform all political problems into technological problems. So we have these contrasting images that are very clear. The other one, another contrasting image is that on one side, we have been going through a pandemic. On top of this one is the pandemic that there is no alternative. For the last 40 years, we have been taught that there is no alternative to neoliberalism and to capitalism, the infamous TINA, there is no alternative. All of a sudden, the pandemic shows that there are alternatives at the level of social interaction, social life. We can change our lives. We can change our ways of dealing with people, not necessarily for the better, also for the worse. We know that feminicide has increased with the pandemic and confinement, while the young parents have also been able to spend more time with their kids, that tiny minority that can do telework in the world. But in any case, we can see that there are possibilities for changes in social life. Yet, there is no change in political life. There seems to be a total exhaustion about political alternatives. If we look at, and I'll see that in the second part of my talk, if you look at the media in the world today, on the way they are portraying this pandemic, we have to look to other forms of communication, to other realities from different epistemologies to see what's going on. Because seen from this, we really don't see any possible change in the future, even though people have changed so much in their political life. And finally, I think that this pandemic is a prism of a cruel transparency, because it's chaotic, it's global, but it has strengthened all the inequalities, all the discriminations of the world. We know people have been made vulnerable by many other pandemics before. The pandemic of hunger, the pandemic of lack of access to health, the pandemic of domestic violence, the pandemic of police brutality. All of a sudden, these people were the privileged target of the virus. The virus hits everybody, it's true, but the mortality rates in any country show very clearly that, in fact, it's strengthening all the inequalities, all the discriminations in our society. So I think that we have these contrasting images are very challenging for us as sociologists. And then there are some unsettling features that are also very intriguing to us. In the last 40 years, we have been told that the state is corrupt, is inefficient, and in fact, the most rational global regulator of social relations are the markets. We have been listening to that on that recipe from 40 years, neoliberalism, Washington consensus, and things like that. All of a sudden, a pandemic comes, and people do not resort to the Goldman Sachs. They don't resort to Citibank. They don't resort to the markets. They resort to the states to protect themselves. And the cruel reality is the states were not there. The states were not there to protect them. In fact, even in societies where the national health services have been stronger in the past, have been underfunded, have been underfunded and also privatized in many countries. We see that in Europe. We don't have to even to leave Europe to see this. We see that in Belgium, in France, in Italy, in Portugal, and in Spain. So you can see that the state, after all, is important during the crisis, but it's not prepared to be there. So what can we do with the state? Is the state just a state of exception, Angaban style, or is something else? Do we need to refund the state on a non-capitalist, non-colonialist, and non-patriarchal metrics? I think this is very important. Why? Because I think the state became very central in the acute phase of the pandemic. As this phase moves away and fades away and withers away, in a sense, the markets come. For instance, foreign debt. Now, we are saying that the IMF and all the multilateral institutions are working to become even more rigorous on the payment of the foreign debt. This is really dangerous because many countries have been indebted to the service of the pandemic. And then we see that, a crisis like the pandemic crisis is good business. We know of the Amazon, we know of Zoom as we use today, how much money the people that invented these technologies are making in our time. And now the United Nations and CNN are saying that the vaccines are the new liquid gold for big pharma. So it looks like, again, there are these unsettling images. Probably a final one is that we could see that during this crisis, there was many differences. We cannot generalize very easily, but there were states, for instance, in this contradiction between protecting life or protecting the economy, there were nuances. Different countries behave in different way. We cannot put on the same foot the behavior of Brazil and the behavior of New Zealand, for instance. They are completely contrasting. So the state has not been homogeneous there. It's very, very heterogeneous, as a matter of fact. But we can see that in most countries, we have seen a surge of authoritarian measures at a point in time in which protest was suspended because social movements in many cities were conducting social protests, and with the pandemic they couldn't because of confinement, because of other things. We see very retrogressive measures, political measures, authoritarian measures having taken place in countries so diverse as the United Kingdom, as Hungary, as India, as Brazil. I mean, it's Colombia, as a matter of fact. So you can see that the states many states use this pandemic to increase authoritarianism, and we have to, on top of that, to see the resurgence and the growth of extreme right movements in the world, and a certain erosion of liberal democratic, as Sari was saying, that we have to defend, in a sense, are being eroded all the time. As we speak now, for instance, we are probably witnessing in Ecuador another coup d'etat, an institutional one, like the one that has impeached Dilma Rousseff, Lugo, and many other leaders. So we know this erosion of democracy is becoming more and more troublesome for all of us. So what sense do we make of this? What shall we be investing our time and our research in the next decade? In my view, it all depends on the scenarios. I have been identifying 3 scenarios in my work, and I see that the different scenarios are calling for different tasks on our part. The first scenario is the scenario of negationism. I see many leaders in the world that are anxious, and in fact, many people in the world that you have to understand. I think that this call for Sari in the beginning is very important at this point because of the confusion. This morning in the social movements, you were seeing how new age kids that used to be on the left are siding with the extreme right people in Germany on the questions of vaccines, on the questions of confinement. There is a confusion here, and we should pay attention to that. It's not by chance that this is occurring. It's occurring because we have an excess of past and a deficit of future. We really don't have reasonable, reliable, coherent alternatives at this point. In fact, we have to reconstruct them. And because of the excess of the past is probably the reason why the extreme right is prevailing in our time, because it's really calling back to the past. It is not the past of the peasants. It is not the past of the indigenous people, because the past of the indigenous people is future-oriented. They are trying to tell us that they used to deal with nature in a specific way, very different from the capitalist way, modern way, but they want it for the future. That could be good for us. This is not the past, the oriented future past of the indigenous people or peasant people in India. This is the past made for the past in trying to recover some golden age that people imagine to have had in the past. So I think that the first scenario is the scenario of negationism. Nothing will be done. People will go back to normal. And I think that this will be most dystopic. This is a scenario in which capitalism will prevail over democracy. And then we'll be listening and noticing more and more news about sociologies around the world that are being threatened by their research. They are not free anymore. Some of my students today in Brazil feel threatened. I have to say this because there is a movement called the Escola Sem Partido, a school without a party, that is really videotaping them, is taping them, and they feel insecure, they feel persecuted. And we are still not in a dictatorship. We are in a democracy in Brazil, even though a very, very constrained democracy at this point. So I think that the first scenario means capitalism prevailing and colonialism and patriarchy, because as people know my work, for me, we don't live in capitalist societies, but in capitalist, colonialist, and patriarchal societies. One of these dominations become more aggressive, the others also become more aggressive. That's what we are witnessing, and we can experience that in our world. So this is the scenario in which capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy will prevail over democracy. The second scenario is the scenario of the gato pardo, is the idea of changing some things so that nothing changes. In fact, nothing essentially will change. If I've been analyzing very closely the editors of Financial Times, and I can read from there precisely this intent that we'll have probably new social contract, more investment in health, probably some renewable energies, but no changes in the production of system, no changes in the consumption systems, no systems in our ways of living. And therefore, we know that our cell phones could last for 20 years, and our computers, but they are made to last for 2 or 1 year. So we are in a world of planned obsolescence that it is really most detrimental to Mother Earth and nature. So I think that the gato pardo will mean for us sociologists an analysis of the impasse, a kind of a tie between democracy and capitalism. Capitalism more and more incompatible with democracy, democracy more and more incompatible with capitalism. That will be an impasse. System will be becoming more aggressive and more authoritarian. The third scenario, and I give the last minutes to my third scenario, is the scenario of the alternative, of the paradigmatic transition. The idea that the virus is giving us an opportunity to see that this civilizatory model that in Latin America is called the neo-extractivism has come to an end, cannot continue. And Mother Earth is telling us that this can't go on because we'll have much more and many more pandemics. So we have to have in our minds, in our studies, the idea that we should struggle for a new model of civilization, the one without really giving away much of that positive things that this civilizatory model brought with it. Never. We can't discard that. We cannot throw away the baby with the bathwater. No, but we have to transit to another really kind of civilizatory model. For that, we cannot do from one day to the next. If we really embark in this, then our sociological work will really mostly concerned with the transition. How do we transit? Because we cannot change. For instance, if a country depends on oil, if a country depends on industrial agriculture, well, cannot change from one day to the next. But we have to start immediately a transition. So I think that this is the only scenario, the third scenario, in which I see democracy prevailing over capitalism, over colonialism, and over patriarchy. So the three scenarios are different moves between democracy and all these forms of domination. It is in the third scenario that I'm investing most of my time. And I think that if you do that, we'll end with the idea of the excess of past and the deficit of future, because we'll have what I've been calling an alternative thinking of alternatives. The alternatives are there. In a book I just finished, it's only available in Portuguese and Spanish, but will be soon available in English. I dedicate a full chapter to community organizations, the creativity of organizations. The most abundant communities have done tremendous things. The solidarity things, the Minga things. As Kate, also Alexander was telling us this morning in South Africa, solidarity, hospitality, one would say, with the Sari and Levinas. So we have seen all this care coming into the communities. So the energies is there. The problem is that whatever exists at the society level, we don't see it up there in the politics. It's not translatable in the conventional politics of our time. So that's why we have to start to conduct an hegemonic struggle for a new hegemony. And the struggle for a new hegemony is a struggle that, of course, focuses on the idea of public goods, the ecological future, the feminist future, new forms of consumption, new forms of production, vaccines. We know we should all be involved against this new apartheid, the vaccines apartheid. That the phrase is not mine, it's from Katie Alexander this morning. So the vaccines may be one of the forms of vaccinal injustice, I would say. It's probably the new dimension. We have already had social injustice, historical injustice, racial injustice, sexual injustice, and now vaccinal injustice. So I think that we are on the eve of seeing all these things, but for that we need other ways of knowing, which I've been calling the epistemology of the South. I see there really the core for our transformation. Of course, it will be also a transformation in our departments, in our sociological departments. We need to bring in new kinds of knowledge, new kinds of people in our university. We have to decolonize our sociological departments. Again, please never throw the babe with the bathwater. Keep the good things. I have learned that for a great liberator against Portuguese colonialism, Amílcar Cabral. It was Amílcar Cabral that told me, never do away with some of this knowledge of science that even the colonizers brought with them. Some of it is precious, other we should discard it. This sense is very complex. And I have to say that some of critical sociology in our time is getting into identitarian ghettos, of which I don't see a good result in the future, because it's part of the divide and rule strategy of colonialism and capitalism. I think that we are in a pre-fascistic period of time. We have to unite different struggles. I think that, as I was claiming, and I'm finishing, that the struggles, probably the single issue social movements, have come to an end. I think that we have to have that all movements should bring in the different dimensions of domination in different ways, but they should try to be more hospitable to the other movements and not really creating such demonization, dogmatism, sectarism that is plaguing very, very often the critical sociology of our time. Not to speak of the conventional sociology, because she's just now crazy about fighting Islamo-gauchism in France and things like that. So I think the struggles are there, the alternatives are there, the instruments are there, and I think we have to be there, because that's where we should be there. We have to take risks. Marielle took risks. It's very easy to say present, but go to Marais, as I have been very often in this, the squatter settlement for where she comes. Please collaborate, all of you, with the museum. We have a Museo da Maré. It's a fabulous museum within this squatter settlement. It's the inspiration for all of us to bring museums, not just in the Louvre, not just in New York, but in the squatter settlements of our time. That's what I call one of the features of demonumentalize the archive and bring in new museums of the really drastic life against oppression and resistance that we are witnessing in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Many thanks, Boaventura. This opening talks. It is now my honor, really a great pleasure to welcome Professor Rita Laura Segato. And she will be talking in Spanish, and we will have a translation in English. So there are two different channels on Zoom, and everyone will be able to listen to her in Spanish or in English. So just to give you time to find out how to do it, I will present her briefly, introduce her. So Professor Rita Laura Segato is Emeritus Professor at the University of Brasilia and Professor at the National University of San Martin in Argentina. Her numerous books include Las estructuras elementales de la violencia, the elementary structures of violence, La Nación y sus otros, the nations and its others, and of course the latest and best known book, La guerra contra las mujeres, the war against women. Together with Boaventura Santos, Ashish Kotari, and Sari Hanafi, Rita is also one of the authors of the book Social Movements and Politics in the Pandemics that is about to be published by Bristol University Press, and it's already available on the public library, the online open library by CLACSA, the Latin American Council of Sociology. Professor Rita Segato is a renowned anthropologist and bioethicist and on feminism and indigenous rights. She has just received the Franz Fanon Lifetime Achievement Award that celebrates her profound transformative impact on the lives of women and people in Latin America. It's really a pleasure to welcome her here in the ISA Forum of Sociology. I hope you are all connected on the right channel on Zoom. So it will be both in English and in Spanish. And Rita, the floor is yours. Rita, muchas gracias por estar con nosotros hoy y por traer esta voz crítica que es la tuya en este foro. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Geoffrey.
Thanks very much, Geoffrey.
Tengo que poner en silencioso porque estoy escuchando la traducción.
I'm listening to the translation, so I need to switch something off.
Please, Geoffrey, please turn off the translation because it comes back to me.
No, it's
very confusing.
You need to put it off. You have.
I put it off. I have put it off, but it comes.
¿Me puede oír ahora en castellano, en español? Now I'm speaking in English again.
Sorry, but
if you speak in
the voice.
Put it Espanol, maybe.
So perhaps if I play down my volume, let's see. Let us try now, okay?
I'm ready to go when Rita
Can
speaks
you hear
Spanish.
Me?
I will speak English.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Quiero decir, para comenzar, que fue tremendamente emocionante,
very emotive for me,
insuperablemente emocionante
really
el video
emotive.
de Marielle.
See the video
Y
of
la
Marielle.
tentación puede decir que Marielle es irreemplazable,
She's unreplaceable.
pero la obligación es decir que habrá innumerables Marielles.
There will be many innumerable Marielles.
una de ellas estará en este lugar que estoy ocupando
In the next
ahora.
forum, one of them will be the place I'm occupying right now.
Muy honrada por esta invitación.
I'm very honored to receive this invitation
de los colegas aquí.
from my colleagues.
No sé si este es mi lugar natural porque
I don't
soy
know if this is my
antropóloga y no
natural
socióloga. Y como
place.
saben,
I'm not a sociologist, but as you know,
los antropólogos y las
anthropologists,
tendemos más a lo filosófico.
we tend to tend more to the
los
philosophical
sociólogos
element.
y las sociólogas en general. Dicho esto,
So, having said that,
voy a leer lentamente para que
I'm
la
going to read slowly so that the interpreter
sea
can
más fácil.
catch it
Un
all.
pequeño texto, ¿no?
It's a short text.
He hablado ya bastante sobre el
I've
modo de
talked a
vida
lot
en
already about
pandemia y
the way of
sus
living in a pandemic
aprendizajes.
and what we can learn from it.
Parto entonces de lo dicho
So I
y
start,
concluyo con una reflexión inacabada.
I
una
end up with
búsqueda.
an
Es
unfinished
un texto que
reflection.
está en
It's a
camino
text
más que un
that's
texto concluido.
It's not conclusive
Hago
yet.
notar que
It's a work
hoy
in
en día he
progress.
entendido la relevancia de lo
I've understood
inacabado
the
frente
importance
a lo
of unfinished
terminado.
things
El
in respect
camino
of
es más
finished
importante
things.
que la llegada, inclusive en los
The
textos.
path,
Y el
the route is more
proceso
important
es
than
más
the arrival,
importante que el producto.
and the context
Y
is more important than the
recuerdo
product.
también que
I also remember
muchas sociedades humanas
that many human societies
valorizan más el proceso
attach more
como
importance to
una
the process
oportunidad
as an
para
opportunity
la convivencia,
for
la
harmonious coexistence,
presencia, la comunión, la
for
conversación,
communion,
la
conversation,
práctica responsorial, por ejemplo, en la música, siempre improvisada
the
en los
use of
sistemas
music,
musicales de otros
often
pueblos,
improvised in many
como más
peoples.
importante que el producto, que acaba siendo
This is more
siempre
important than the
elemento
product at the
conclusivo,
end of the
el
process,
final que lleva a la separación. Entonces,
which
este
unfortunately,
texto va
by the time you
a
get to the
dar
end
un
of the
panorama
process,
breve
often
por
the result is a
otras,
separation. So I want to look
por
at
lo que he
other
dicho en textos anteriores sobre
considerations.
este
And
escena
I've
que
referred to
estamos
this in previous
atravesando,
texts as
la
well.
historia hoy, la escena pandémica,
Looking
y
back
concluiré con una
and then
parte
looking at the
justamente
pandemic,
inconclusiva,
and then looking
inacabada.
at the end of my talk on this
Veo la
of
pandemia
inconclusive
como
nature of
un
things.
gran
I see
escáner que va
the
revelando
pandemic is a great
las
scanner.
entrañas
It's like
tensionadas del
revealing
mundo.
the insides of the world.
Podría ser que lleve a un reseteo, ella
It might
podría
lead
llevar
us
a un
to a certain
reseteo,
reset. We might
a una
reinitialize.
reinicialización. Disculpen, pero I am looking, there are problems with the translation.
Yes, Rita, that's not
seeing
real.
the messages in the list.
It's in fact, it's actually the beginning of the forum, and so, but normally, if I understand it well, I thought there would be two different channels.
Audio?
But at least we have here, it's possible to listen to only to the translation or to Spanish and English.
Okay. Entonces, veo la pandemia, como dije, como un gran escáner que va revelando las entrañas tensionadas del mundo.
The tense
podría
innards of the
llevar a
world,
un
if you like.
reseteo,
That might lead it to a certain reset.
A una reinicialización,
A
a
reinitialization,
una continuidad de lo que existe.
or a continuity of what already
Es incierto
exists.
lo que sucederá. Y he
It's uncertain
enfatizado
what's going to
varias
happen.
veces que una de las grandes
One of
lecciones
the
de la
big
pandemia es
lessons of the
que
pandemic,
aceptemos la incerteza en la
we
historia,
should
que es una
accept this
característica
uncertainty.
crucial para
It's
que el
crucial
mundo pueda ser transformado.
so
O
that
sea,
the world can be
los dueños del
transformed.
mundo intentan siempre
The people who run the show in the
convencernos de
world
que no
try to
existe la
convince us
incerteza y de
that
que
this
no
uncertainty
existe
doesn't exist.
una historia que pueda huir del control. La incerteza es la más importante de las
Uncertainty
lecciones
is a very
pandémicas.
important lesson
En
from
una
this
era en que
pandemic,
nos
in an area where
nos querían hacer pensar que la
they wanted to make
incerteza
us
no
think that
existía más.
uncertainty didn't
Un
exist.
mundo estructurado por la dueñidad
A
que
world
pretendía tener un
structured
control
through
sobre la
ownership,
naturaleza
which want to
y
have
sobre la
control of
historia.
nature.
Y ahí es que
And
aparece la pandemia
where the
diciendo
pandemic
que no es así,
comes on the scene to
que
show
la
us that that's not the
incerteza
case at all.
permanece y en
Uncertainty
realidad
prevails.
la incerteza es el gran triunfo
It's a
de
pity
toda
that
voluntad
the
insurgente,
great
porque sin
triumph
incerteza
of
no
all
hay
this
cambio histórico posible.
will that people have to change
Las
things.
grandes tensiones que creo que la
The
pandemia
great
revela
tensions that the
y se
pandemic
relacionan con
reveal,
las temáticas de este gran encuentro
which is the
son
theme of this great meeting,
las siguientes.
the following
La
ones.
primera,
The first,
¿cuál es la llave de la historia? La
what's the
llave de la
key to this,
historia es
to this story?
económica o
It's
es
economic,
política.
or
El
is it
viejo
political?
debate que
The
todos,
old debate,
sobre todo los sociólogos,
especially the
conocen.
sociologists know it very well.
La llave de la historia parecería mostrar la pandemia es política.
But
O
it's
sea,
political.
se han suspendido negocios, cerrado
Business have
puertos,
shut,
cancelado
ports and airports
el
have
trabajo de los
closed,
transportes. Cuando uno
transport
ve,
has
por
come to a
ejemplo, en China,
standstill. China, for
500
example,
trenes de
500
más de un
trains
kilómetro de
a day,
longitud
1
parados
kilometer
en una
long,
estación,
stopped
que
there
son
in
llevados
a
a no
station.
funcionar por una decisión
And
política.
it's a political
Cuando uno
decision that
ve
led
el
to that.
cancelamiento de una gran
When
cantidad
you
de
see
encuentros
imprisonment
comerciales,
or
el
the
cierre de
lockdown of
negocios de diferente
businesses,
magnitud, de comercios de diferente
trade
magnitud, uno se da cuenta
being scaled
de
down, you
que la
realize then
llave de la historia
that the key to the
podría ser
story
política.
could be
¿no?
political.
Y lo supimos en 2008,
And what we saw
cuando
in
los bancos salieron al
2008,
rescate de las
when
deudas, cuando el Estado salió
when
al
the
rescate de
states
las deudas
rescued the
de los
banks,
bancos. Lo vimos en 1929, cuando
we saw it
el Estado
in
salió al rescate
1999,
de una
when the
economía
state
quebrada en
did
los
the same,
Estados Unidos. Lo vimos
in
en
the
el
USA,
final de
did
la
the
Segunda
same with
Guerra
a
Mundial, y
bankrupt
lo
economy.
vemos en esta pandemia.
And we can see it in this
Como
pandemic.
hay una
It's the
llave
key.
política para
There's a
esto.
political
Solo
key.
basta accionarla.
We just need
Pero
to,
ahí tenemos, por el otro
it was
lado,
just necessary to
la agencia
get
de
it
los
going.
dueños del mundo en
But the
esta
owners of
época
the
de
world,
refeudalización,
they're
con
looking for a
feudos de una magnitud
refeudalization
como
of the
nunca
world
los hubo antes,
on a scale never seen
donde
before.
pocas personas controlan
Very
la
few
mayor
people
parte de la riqueza,
control most of
y
the
son
wealth,
por lo tanto ellas también dueñas de las llaves de
so
la
they are
política.
the owners of
Y esto sin
everything,
dejar de
of the keys to
considerar
everything.
un mundo subterráneo
And there's
que
an
muestra
underground
el
world
carácter ficcional de
which
las
shows
instituciones
the
en
fictional
las que
nature of
depositamos una
institutions
fe
in
religiosa,
which we
revisitando
have
aquí
sort
a
of
Durkheim,
religiously believe in,
pero en una nueva torsión más extrema.
but we're
Nuestra
now in a
fe
new extreme situation.
institucional en
Our
realidad es
faith in institutions
es contrariada por la existencia de esta
is
segunda
sort of
realidad
debunked by
estructura
this new reality.
mafiosa en la
These
cual también
mafia-like
los políticos, la
structures
política partidaria
and
participan.
party politics.
Porque por ahí fluyen caudales de riqueza
There are
posiblemente
wealth
iguales
flows
a los declarados en la superficie de las
possibly
leyes, los impuestos, y
similar
los
to the
bancos.
ones we see on the
Basta
surface
uno
with taxes
asomarse
and laws
al
and things,
blog
but underground
del
there are
Tax
also other
Justice
flows.
Network, que en algún
There's the
lugar nos
Tax
dijo
Justice Network
que la riqueza no
says that
declarada
non-declared wealth
probablemente igual a la
is probably
riqueza
just
declarada.
as much as
Esto
the amount of
decreta
declared
la
wealth in the world.
ficcionalidad de las
And this
instituciones.
shows the
Es
fictional
un
nature of the
paraestado
institutions.
gigantesco lo que hay en el mundo y se siente de forma muy particular
And
en
this is
América
really
Latina,
felt in
con su
Latin America
paraeconomía, su
with its
paralegalidad,
para-economy,
su parapolicía,
para-legality,
su paracomunicación.
para-police, and
En
para-communication.
segundo lugar,
Secondly,
la pandemia pone en juego, abre una interrogación
there's
sobre
a
si
question about
las fronteras políticas pueden ser también fronteras
The
biológicas.
political
Es
frontiers could
posible
be biological
que
ones.
estados, que naciones poderosas tengan
Powerful
con
countries,
la posibilidad de una compra masiva
they can have the
de
great power
vacunas,
to buy vaccines,
frenar en sus fronteras el ingreso de
and stop,
un virus con
try to
mutaciones
try and stop
incontrolables que
a virus crossing their borders,
su
a virus
tránsito
which
por
mutates all the time. It's
espacios
crazy.
nacionales no vacunados.
And
Nos dicen que no. Los biólogos
biologists,
que tienen una
virologists
conciencia planetaria nos
who
dicen que
think
no.
in planetary
O
terms,
la
really
inoculación
obviously
de
say
la
that's not the
vacuna
case.
Es universal o no habrá seguridad.
The vaccine
para
needs to be
ninguna
universal,
nación.
otherwise there won't be any security for anybody.
La pandemia nos revela que
The
las fronteras
pandemic reveals
políticas
that political
nacionales no
frontiers,
son y
national
jamás podrán
frontiers,
ser fronteras
are not
biológicas.
and never can
Eso
be
es algo
biological.
a tomar en consideración.
That's something to be taken
En
into
tercer
account.
lugar,
Thirdly,
ha puesto en escena, ha puesto en la mira, ha mostrado al mundo un gran agravamiento de la violencia de género, ¿no?
Great increase in
en
gender
esta
violence
gestión de la vida
has taken place.
puerta adentro, en esta gestión
This
doméstica
life,
de la vida,
living behind closed
que para
doors
muchos se ha
is for a lot
impuesto,
of people,
¿no? con los toques de queda, con la
with
imposibilidad de salir a
curfews,
la calle,
not allowed out on the
la
street,
violencia de género,
the
que es
gender
constitutiva
violence.
de las relaciones estructuradas por las relaciones de género,
As a
esta
result
se ha
of
agravado.
the structure of
Entonces,
gender
vemos
relations has become
la
worse.
emergencia aún
We see
mayor
the
de una
even
frustración
greater
masculina
emergence of
de hombres contenidos dentro de casa en un
men
espacio que no
frustrated
saben
in a
gestionar.
confined space
Y
that they don't
ahí
know how to
aparece
manage
la
well.
frustración como un problema enorme de la masculinidad. Los
This
hombres
male
incapaces
frustration is a
de
tremendous problem for them.
procesar, digerir su propia
They can't
frustración,
process or
evitando que
digest
se
the
vuelva
situation.
contra los suyos
And
bajo la forma de una
unfortunately, the
violencia
consequences are
muchas
usually
veces letal.
seen in terms of violence, often
Entonces, por un lado,
lethal.
tenemos este problema
So,
enorme, ¿no?
that's a major
de
problem.
la violentogenia propia del encierro en el espacio
That being
doméstico,
closed in,
por
being locked
voluntades
down for so long is
masculinas que
creating
están
this sort of problems.
acostumbradas a hacerse a la calle, abrir la puerta
People
e
who are
irse
just used to
al
opening the
mundo.
door and walking out on the street, but they can't do that
Por el otro
anymore.
lado, tenemos
then,
que la experiencia de una gestión doméstica que se expande, ¿no?
We also have
que
an
tiene
experience
su
of
propio estilo de
domestic
gestión de la
management,
vida,
if you like, which is
y
sort
que
of
tiene su
expanding.
forma propia de politicidad. Y ahí
It has its own
las mujeres nos
forms
vemos
of
confirmadas en nuestra forma
politicization.
propia de politicidad, o sea,
Women
de
are used
gestión
to
de la
this sort of
vida,
life and managing
expandida
life at home.
ahora, ¿no? por la imposición
But
de
it's
las
now been
cuarentenas y la imposición de la
affected by the
pandemia.
imposition of
Entonces se
quarantine
abre
and
aquí
things
una
like
gran
that.
pregunta, ¿no?
So there's a big question here.
¿Qué mundo, qué espacio colonizará el otro? ¿Será que el espacio público, casa afuera, con los vicios patriarcales de la gestión pública, ¿no? continuarán entrando en casa y imponiéndose en la gestión casera? ¿O podremos
the new
finalmente
order,
con
if you
esta
like, impose itself on the way we run our affairs at
nuestra
home?
forma de gestión se magnifica a través de una presión por el confinamiento casa adentro? ¿Sea que seremos capaces de expandir lo que he llamado una politicidad femenina hacia la calle, hacia el mundo y hacia la gestión?
What I call
Ahí vemos
a female politicization
un
outdoors,
forcejeo, una conflictividad
rather
entre
than
dos formas de visión de lo que es política, de hacer política, de proteger la vida, de hacer un impacto en la vida colectiva, una al estilo femenino, la politicidad de las mujeres, que toma una magnitud mayor en tiempo de pandemia y el encierro casa adentro, y la politicidad masculina que a través de estos momentos ingresa en nuestra casa y parece imponer sus pautas y su patrón al interior de nuestra vida doméstica. En cuarto lugar, vemos también el agravamiento del apartheid de la raza y de la clase, sobre todo en las metrópolis. Los que tienen que salir a trabajar, los que tienen que enfrentar los transportes públicos para ir al trabajo, los que no pueden aislarse y operar como nosotros con computador, con videoconferencia, están expuestos a la enfermedad y a la muerte. Y ahí hay un claro apartheid impuesto por las diferencias de posibilidades y el privilegio de los que podemos trabajar de esta forma. Por el otro lado, vemos ciertos ejemplos muy interesantes en América Latina de lo que siempre he llamado y he visto como comunidades que viven a puerta semiabierta, comunidades que viven en su escondite, que se han encerrado en esta escena contemporánea y que utilizan sus formas de know-how de vida comunal, y eso lo he visto en sociedades indígenas como por ejemplo Krenak, Mapuche, Imbia Guaraní, que se han replegado a sus espacios propios y ahí han llevado la vida a salvo de la pandemia. Estas dos situaciones son propias de este momento. Unas dan esperanza. Por ejemplo, la posibilidad y la estrategia del escondite, la estrategia de la comunidad a puerta semiabierta, que ha sido siempre la estrategia de la sobrevivencia para nuestros pueblos, para los pueblos indígenas y afrodescendientes que han cultivado la forma comunal de existencia en nuestro continente. En quinto lugar, la pregunta y la atención relativa a la naturaleza. ¿Es ella, la cosa cartesiana, el objeto apropiable y circunscripto a nuestra grilla monetaria y científico-tecnocrática? ¿O somos parte de ella? El virus, que es un momento de la historia natural, nos dice, estamos sujetos a la naturaleza, somos parte de ella, no dueños de ella. Y ahí de nuevo vemos esta tensión entre esas dos posibilidades que la pandemia con su gran escáner expone. En sexto lugar, tenemos la cuestión del cuerpo ausente en el trabajo, la comunicación virtual, sin cuerpo, que revela lo que es llamado pulsión de multitud, porque sentimos la importancia del cuerpo, de la copresencia, de la cocorporalidad. Hay una dimensión de la comunicación que lo verbal, lo puramente verbal, no consigue, y que la proyección de nuestra imagen en un plano bidimensional tampoco consigue. Falta algo, y sufrimos física y psíquicamente por esa falta. Descubrir esa falta de la copresencia es fundamental. Ponerle nombre es más fundamental todavía. Sentir que la comunicación no es puramente referencial, informativa, como muchos pueblos lo sienten y lo saben desde siempre, pero el Occidente no. El Occidente nos ha conducido a la idea de que hablar es informar, comunicarnos es informar. Y ahora, con la ausencia del cuerpo, con la ausencia, con la imposibilidad de cocorporalidad, nos damos cuenta de que no es así. Comunicar no es informar, es mucho más que eso. Entonces, esto entra en tensión con la formación de los pueblos en la idea de responsabilidad colectiva. Tenemos la pulsión de multitud y lo vemos en la calle, una gente que no se hace responsable de la vida de los otros, que no participa de una reciprocidad con los otros, que no está formada en una idea de reciprocidad y que pretenden salir hacia la multitud solamente por estar en contacto con los otros cuerpos, con las otras personas, porque no han aprendido, porque nuestros estados no han sido capaces de enseñarles la importancia de los otros, la importancia de un mundo en reciprocidad. Eso está mostrando el déficit de responsabilización. Entendemos, por lo tanto, por un lado, la pulsión de multitud, la lección de la importancia de la copresencia y de la cocorporalidad, y por el otro, el déficit de responsabilidad que no consigue explicar que esa pulsión debe ser controlada. El problema es que no podemos hacer recomendaciones, y aquí viene otro gran tema. Lo siento, pero estoy convencida de que hacer recomendaciones de cómo debe ser el mundo ya no sirve, porque la razón moral, la razón humanitaria ha llegado a su punto de obsolescencia. Estamos en un momento de la historia en que la razón moral y la razón humanitaria no consiguen convencimiento. Entonces, ¿cuál es nuestro papel, ¿no? Como intelectuales, como gente que trabaja con la palabra? Nuestro papel es donar vocabulario con el que la gente pueda dar sentido a la escena de que participa. Ayudar a entender en qué momento nos encontramos. No hacer recomendaciones porque todo indica de que no serán oídas. Entonces, tenemos nuestro vocabulario, porque con eso trabajamos, somos trabajadores de la palabra, podrá dar elementos de análisis y alternativas. Podrá colocar a mano de la gente los nombres que puedan servir de espejo a la realidad que las personas están viviendo. Eso es lo que han hecho, por ejemplo, desafortunadamente, las iglesias hiperconservadoras, fundamentalistas, que se han colocado entre la gente, se han instalado y han instalado su vocabulario entre la gente. Ese es un trabajo que ni las vanguardias partidarias, ni las vanguardias de los movimientos sociales, ni las agencias estatales han conseguido hacer. Y las iglesias lo han conseguido porque han instalado su vocabulario entre la gente, por lo menos en este continente latinoamericano. Es ahí que debe radicar nuestro trabajo, o sea, sembrar con palabras, algunas útiles, otras posiblemente no, la vida de la gente. No lo hemos hecho todavía. Las universidades permanecen distantes y ajenas, alienadas del lugar en el que existen, del territorio donde tienen los pies. Entonces, parto ahora hacia ese final inconclusivo que he anotado aquí para para terminar mi exposición. Y parto de una oposición que he propuesto entre dos destinos de existencia que se encuentran distantes entre sí, dos metas de satisfacción, realización y felicidad que se encuentran distantes entre sí y que son asociadas a proyectos históricos divergentes, ¿no? Por un lado, el proyecto histórico de los vínculos propio de la vida comunal y por el otro, el proyecto histórico de las cosas. Tienden en direcciones diferentes, pero nosotros y nosotras, las personas de este tiempo, vivimos con un pie en cada proyecto. La vida hoy es anfibia. Por momentos nos dirigimos y afirmamos los vínculos, por otros momentos afirmamos las cosas. En algunos momentos invertimos cosas en los vínculos, como es la fiesta, ¿no? Como son las celebraciones y los rituales, y en otros momentos invertimos vínculos y perdemos vínculos por adquirir las cosas. Están en tensión, pero ambos existen para todas las personas, o para casi todas las personas que habitan este mundo y este momento de la historia. Entonces, a partir de esas dos, de la oposición entre esos dos proyectos históricos, hice una lista de oposiciones. No voy a tener tiempo de explicarlas todas ellas, pero es un plan, es un programa para un texto más extenso y futuro. Por un lado, la gestión doméstica en tensión con la gestión pública. La vida casa adentro y entre nosotras y nosotros pasa a asumir un peso mayor, y por otro lado la gestión pública que tiene la impronta fuertemente patriarcal. Por otro lado, la diferencia de la potencia y el poder. La potencia de cuidar, de hacer vivir, de garantizar la vida, y por el otro lado, el poder en que se transforma esa potencia cuando se quiere tener control sobre la vida y sobre los cuerpos. Infelizmente, la política clásica, convencional, nos impide percibir que son distintas estas dos formas, digamos, de empoderamiento y poderío. La potencia es pro vida, el poder es pro muerte. Infelizmente, todavía muchos en la política piensan que se tiene una posibilidad de mejorar la historia, de reencaminar la historia y mejorar la vida mediante la adquisición y el atesoramiento de poder. Descuidan así la potencia, que es un fenómeno de la sociedad. Y ahí pasamos a una gran diferencia, que es el movimiento de la sociedad como algo distinto a los movimientos sociales. Hemos puesto demasiado esfuerzo en los movimientos sociales y en los partidos políticos con sus vanguardias bastante apropiadoras y muchas veces autoritarias, y hemos descuidado el hecho de que solamente el movimiento de la sociedad reorienta la historia. Aquí, esto es una cita de Aníbal Quijano, el gran pensador recientemente fallecido. Por el otro lado, tenemos la diferencia enorme entre el placer y el gozo. El placer es interactivo, es relacional. El gozo es el gozo de algo, el gozo de un cuerpo, el gozo de un consumo, de una consumición, el gozo de una cosa, el gozo de un cuerpo, cosa. Por el otro lado, también tenemos la diferencia entre creatividad y productividad, que es una diferencia entre dos formas diferentes de estar en el tiempo. Y esto se ha mostrado fuertemente con la pandemia. El tiempo creativo es distinto al tiempo de la producción, al tiempo de la productividad, al tiempo productivo. Hagamos valer más algo que hemos conocido en esta época en que muchos negocios se cerraron, en que varias formas de consumo se suspendieron, y es el tiempo propio de la creatividad, que tiene otro ritmo. Luego tenemos la diferencia entre las máximas de la Revolución Francesa, igualdad, libertad, fraternidad, que deben emanar a partir de un tercero, que es el Estado, que es la esfera pública, y nuestra máxima, que es la de la reciprocidad en un medio caracterizado por el pluralismo radical. Le falta esta máxima a la Revolución Francesa. La repito, reciprocidad en un mundo plural. Dando un paso más todavía, la diferencia entre horizonte abierto de una historia incierta y la utopía mal definida en los últimos tiempos como un destino cerrado y preconcebido de futuro. Ese destino cerrado y preconcebido de futuro obligatorio le hace muchas veces daño al horizonte abierto, que es el de la incerteza de la historia. Y ahí vienen las oposiciones a las que no me voy a referir en detalle, entre comunidad y sociedad, entre dualidad y binarismo, entre pueblos diversos que ocupan el espacio de una nación y ciudadanía. Son varias lógicas diferentes que debemos considerar y ponderar, entre las cuales tenemos que elegir. Son caminos que se bifurcan, transitamos en los dos, pero debemos nombrarlos en su diferencia. Y por aquí me quedo esperando que la traducción haya sido capaz de comunicar lo que quise decir.
Muchas gracias, Rita. Muchas gracias por esta ponencia. Y voy a decir unas palabras a ver, espera que Rita nos escucha también. Rita, ¿estás con nosotros? Ahí. Sí. Bueno, muchas gracias, Rita. Y bueno, por esta tan importante escuchar tu voz, que se escuchó tanto en inglés que en español. Voy a pedir una disculpa a todos los hispanohablantes que durante la primera parte, unos 7-8 minutos de la ponencia, tuvimos la sobreposición del idioma inglés y castellano. Y bueno, sí había pedido varias veces que no había problemas técnicos y sí surgieron aquí durante unos minutos, pero al final lo resolvió Carmina McLaurin, que quiero agradecer, la organizadora del Foro Social Mundial. Eso nos muestra la fuerza de la otra organización, de la ayuda mutua, que es mucho más eficaz de repente que las organizaciones transnacionales. Y el buen lado es que por eso escuchamos a Rita 10 minutos más que previsto, así que la aprovechamos al máximo. Y bueno, le pido disculpa a Rita por la primera parte, que se escuchó perfectamente en inglés, tanto en español que en inglés, pero creo que ahí vamos a circular más información en inglés y en español. Well, now in English, many thanks to David Griffiths, the translator, FNRS-CriDIS SEGATO for a talk. And apologies also for the superposition of English and Spanish only for the Spanish speaker. So for English speakers, it seems that it was very well, with this excellent translation by David. Well, as I said, finally it could be solved by Carmina McLaurin, who was the chair of the the organizer of the World Social Forum just a few weeks ago. So that's where we have help from the World Social Forum to solve our technical issues. But then the good thing is that we could take advantage of Rita's 10 more minutes because of this technical problem. So, and of course, a global dialogue also requires sometimes patience, tolerance, and of course, some learnings that we have been doing to get now in a multilingual and plural world. These were all important words by Rita, and I'm so glad that thanks to David, they could be translated to travel to the English-speaking world, in addition of a Spanish-speaking audience that already know her work very well. Now we move to India. I'm so glad to have with us one of the most insightful sociologists of India. Is also an activist. It was just everywhere these days. He was also one of the organizers and a very active part of the World Social Forum just a month ago, also online. Ashish Kothari is one of the founders of Beirut, an Indian non-profit organization working on environmental and social issues at the local, national, and global level. He was trained at the Indian Institute of Public Administration and used to be the coordinator of India's National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. He helps coordinating the National Vikalp Sanggam, which seems to mean Alternatives Conference in India, and is also one of the coordinator of a fantastic global initiative named the Global Tapestry of Alternatives and Radical, and another one called Radical Ecological Democracy. You will find all this online. He's a co-author of several books, including Churning the Earth, and the co-editor of a very famous and widely diffused book that is available for free online. It has been translated into many languages. In English, its title is PluriverseAshish, a post-development dictionary, and of course, he's one of the authors of a book on social movement. So, Ashish, I don't see you in my video, but I'm sure that you are somewhere over here. Now I give you the floor for some 20 minutes.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Geoffrey. Thanks to the entire team of organizers for this incredible, despite the minor small glitches that you just had, the sort of incredible effort that must have gone into organizing something for thousands of people on a virtual platform for the first time. Very, very honored to be here. Also, of course, in the memory of Marielle Franco, and very honored to be following two brilliant scholars just before me, and before that, of course, Sari, yourself, Geoffrey, and Jacob. One of the advantages of coming after all of you is that I hopefully will not have to repeat some of what has already been said, and said much more better than I can say it, especially in terms of the problems that we face, the crises that we face. So I'll skip over some of that very quickly and move into, as soon as possible, move into this issue of that Boa brought out about the deficit of the future, or what Rita spoke about in terms of values and reciprocity. And I think Sari also brought out in terms of values, and your own stress, Geoffrey, on intersectionality. Now, I'm not nearly as good a speaker as Boa and Rita, so I will have to resort to slides. So I'm going to be showing some images, which I think might also help in understanding some of the context that I'll be speaking about. So please just let me know if this works. Do you see it full screen?
Yes, we see it. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm speaking about what we in India here call eco-Swaraj, and I'll explain that a bit later in the presentation, or in English, radical ecological democracy, and I will explain both of these phrases. And I also want to stress something in the current context, which is that as we emerge out of the COVID crises, or multiple other global crises that are simultaneously going on, people are talking about either business as usual, which is what a lot of governments are trying to do, or we're talking about a Green New Deal, such as in the US and UK and Europe. But I want to talk about a Rainbow New Deal, or a Rainbow Revolution that I think we need. Now, this is familiar to all of us, and many of the earlier speakers have spoken about it, the multiple crises that that we're all going through in whichever place of the world we are in, and of course at a global scale. And I want to stress that this is a crisis that's both collective and individual, personal, and we face it in these very, very different sorts of ways. And in a way, what I see is the path that we've taken in the last few centuries, and especially the last few decades of so-called globalized development, is, to my mind, the path of moving from occupations, economic lives that were part of cultures, part of societies, part of ecologies, not that everything was perfect, but there was some kind of integrity there, to what is now a massively divided life. My work life is different from my leisure, so that's why I wait desperately for the weekend and for vacations. This whole idea that work and pleasure and leisure is separate is something that has come to us now. And I call this movement from livelihoods to deadlihoods. Even those of us who are earning relatively well in modern economy, for the vast majority of people, these are soul deadening jobs. There's no creativity. If you look at the mass assembly chains that many of us are in, there's no pleasure in what we're doing, even if we might be richer in the process. And I think this is something we really need to confront. As everybody else has spoken, the COVID completely unprecedented period in human history has given us many, many lessons. And in a kind of broadly simplistic way, two pathways. One is the pathway which many governments and corporations are taking, which is more authoritarianism, more profit making. You see the figure there of $600 billion more being made by a few billionaires at the same time where hundreds of millions of people lost their jobs. Or we have the pathway of greater solidarity, of working with each other, of bringing into the center of life the positive human parts of our features of being able to work together, extending solidarity, extending love, and being selfless. And I think it's a very clear division. Now, of course, which way we go, or whether we go into a mix, such as the three scenarios that Boa spoke about, is something that we'll see over time. But the big question that arises, everybody's asking, okay, we know there's a problem, and COVID is a sort of a manifestation of that problem, a fundamental divide between us and the rest of nature, and within human societies also. But are there alternatives, or are we stuck to Margaret Thatcher's dictum of Tina, which I think Boa spoke about? I think in order to answer that question, one of the most important things is to ask ourselves, alternatives to what? Because we're being given very pat answers. We keep creating waste, let's just recycle it. We keep emitting carbon, let's make sure it's being captured somewhere else. We have fossil fuel cars, so the Green New Deal, everybody should have an electric car. And to my mind, these solutions, or so-called solutions, don't really challenge the fundamentals of the problem, which others have spoken about, which in a simple way, not in a complex, nuanced way, but in a simple way, is really about the concentration of power to dominate, power over others, which is corporations in a capitalist society, states in a state-dominated society, including state socialism, by the way. And I wouldn't put all the eggs in the capitalist basket here. Of course, much older patriarchy, which Rita spoke eloquently about. In the Indian context, casteism, which is also very old, very, very deep-rooted, racism in many parts of the world, and of course, the human domination over the rest of nature. We seem to have forgotten, at least modern human beings have seemed to have forgotten, that there's 50 million other species that coexist, or supposed to be coexisting with us on the planet. So if we want to talk about alternatives, and if we don't want to get lost in these, what I call superficial solutions or false solutions, such as techno fixes, geoengineering, market responses to the climate crisis, green growth, and to my mind, even sustainable development, at least in the way it's formulated in the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, we have to be able to go much more fundamental and challenge the structures and the relations of oppression and unsustainability. So there are two parts to what I think these alternatives could be and are. Firstly, resistance. people's resistance to these structures and relations of oppression, inequality, unsustainability, exploitation, marginalization, etc. This image, for instance, is from a movement of indigenous people in central India 30 years back against two mega hydroelectricity projects. And when they were protesting against it, they were not only talking about the fact that they will lose their livelihoods, they will lose their forests, they will be displaced from wherever they are, but also, and more importantly, that this river is not megawatts, it's not electricity, it's our mother. And we will not allow our mother to be shackled by your projects. So what we see in these movements of resistance are alternative ways of being, of doing, of knowing, of dreaming. And that is so very important, because otherwise we're always told Western, modern, globalized development is the only way to go. And we see this kind of resistance, what in India Gandhi made popular as the Satyagraha, that is speaking truth to power. We see it in so many different forms all over the world. Right now in India, for instance, possibly the world's largest people's movement for a long time is the one with the farmers, where it's very interesting is that it started off as a farmers movement, but there's incredible amounts of intersectionality being built into it with environmentalists, human rights activists, feminists, lots of different kinds of things expressing their solidarity with it. Same with the anti-racism movement, and many, many others, of course, that many of you are familiar with. But along with resistance, we also, of course, need constructive alternatives to meeting human needs and aspirations. People are deprived, people are hungry, people are facing all kinds of injustices and deprivations, and we need constructive solutions that are not what the mainstream development model is telling us. And fortunately, we do have, as many of the previous speakers have spoken, we have fantastic examples of those all over the world. And we need to do much more, whether we are sociologists or activists or social scientists or anything, natural scientists or whatever form of knowledge generation we're doing, we have to work much more on this. We've worked a lot on the critiques, the problems, but not nearly enough in trying to understand and bring out in both scientific and popular literature and different forms these alternative movements. I don't have that. By the way, this map I love putting up because I think it's an extremely decolonizing map. Whenever I put it up in India, people say, oh, why is it upside down? And it gets into a very nice conversation about how the maps we're used to, the so-called normal right side up maps, are maps that were given to us in colonial times, where Europe was put on top and Europe was made to look much bigger than it physically actually is. I'm just going to give you 2 or 3 quick examples of the kind of alternatives which are pointing to the systemic transformations. This is from the most oppressed section of Indian society, Dalit women, small farmers. They're triple oppressed: patriarchy, casteism, and class divides. In the last 30 years, from a situation of hunger, deprivation, lack of access to health and education, and so on, they have moved by bringing back their traditional diversity of crops and seeds, doing a lot of work collectively rather than as individual farmers, bringing back their and reasserting their own knowledge systems, and moving towards what they call food sovereignty. We call it Anna Swaraj here, which is to say complete control over everything to do with the food, the seed, the water, the land, the knowledge, and many, many other things. And through that kind of transformation, not just change their status in terms of food and agriculture, but also their status as women, and also their status as so-called outcasts in Hindu society, to gain much more respect in these villages. And I think Geoffrey already mentioned this example, because we had documented it, how the same women who were hungry 25, 30 years back have been contributing to the food relief work in the COVID period. The second one, which I find extremely inspiring, is also led by women. This is the Kurdish movement for eco-feminist, direct, radical democracy in the middle of the world's most war-torn area. And that's why it's even more remarkable. It's an extremely patriarchal, traditionally extremely patriarchal society, but also conflict-ridden with militaries all around it. And in that sense, it's fantastic how they have been able to achieve some level of very radical direct democracy based on what they call genealogy, J-I-N, which is an eco-feminist principle, democratic confederalism, and many other things. One of the things we've been trying to do is to document, firstly in India, but now also globally, these stories of resilience in COVID times. Why were some communities more resilient than others? And there's some incredible lessons coming out of that. Collective rights, the ability to rebuild their communal or community structures, leadership of different kinds, especially women's and youth leadership, and many other factors. And I think this is something that a lot more work has to be done on. Very quickly, I think two other sort of spheres of transformation that are beginning to happen, much more has to happen: education and learning. Because I think that's where, I mean, if you look at what's happened in India, the British were very clever. So-called Lord Macaulay, who put in India's education system, which we unfortunately still use, he said, if you want to continue colonizing a country, military is not the way to go. You have to brainwash minds and make them just like us. So we are white, they're brown, but they'll be what we call brown sahibs, which is essentially they'll just be brown colonialists, which is unfortunately what has happened. So we gained independence, but the government, the parties that took over, more or less the same. So our education system actually is geared to making people fit into the current system, corporate or government system. It's geared to make people selfish, individualistic, private, want to become famous, rich, powerful, etc. So these are examples from different parts of the world of switching that, of decolonizing education, of seeing how can education be something where young people rebuild learning within the community, within the ecosystems they're in, and express their own creativity, and it becomes fun. And I love going into words, and this is something I'm sure sociologists do or should be doing. And I found when I started working on this that the origin of the word school is schole in Greek, which meant leisure. 95% of schools in India are prisons, nothing to do with leisure. So also how words kind of change through history to suit the system. Also then technology and media and arts, which have got increasingly captured by the corporate sector, or of course by governments, depending on which part of the world you're in, and to look at what are the kinds of alternative technologies, democratic forms of media and arts that are part of the social movements and part of the alternatives. So let me take another 5 minutes or so to kind of bring this together in what I think is the sorts of transformation that are happening, and much more needs to happen. What's the sort of more holistic framework emerging from this? The way we've tried to develop it as part of a process in India called the Alternatives Confluence is to see transformations happening in 5 sectors of life. Now, of course, there's a lot of intersectionality here, so it's a bit artificial to divide it into these 5, but just for the sake of understanding: politics, economics, society, culture, and environment or ecology. I'm just going to quickly go over some of this, not all of it, because we don't have time. With politics, as some people have already said, we've been focused way too long on elections and on representative democracy all across the world. We've forgotten that the word democracy is about power of the people, our power. It's inherent in us, and we have just given it over to politicians and to bureaucrats. And so there are movements all over the world which are saying, no, we have to reclaim that power. We want self-determination. We want, like 90 villages in central India have declared, in our village, we are the government. All decisions in our village will be taken by us as part of the village assembly by consensus. There are different ways. There are indigenous self-determination movements, so many different kinds of things which are asserting real democracy on the ground. And then, of course, also making the state accountable insofar as and until the state exists, which eventually, hopefully, will not. As part of that, of course, is the radicalization and democratization of the economy, so that you take it back from the capitalists and you take it back from the government and say workers in control of the means of production. An economy of caring and sharing, recognizing the incredible contribution that women and young people and elderly make, which is never part of the GDP or economic growth calculations, bringing indicators of well-being, which are much more qualitative, talking about the commons rather than private, recommoning private spaces as is happening in many parts of the world. And then, of course, as very much part of both the radical political democracy and radical economic democracy have to be the struggles for social justice, for gender justice, for sexuality justice, for against casteism, racism, etc. And one thing that I think is very, very important for all of us here on this call is the continued, and Boaz stressed this in terms of decolonization or epistemologies of the South, the continued assertion of the relevance of diversity of knowledge, diversity of cultures, diversity of languages, diversity of foods in opposition to kind of homogenization that's taken place. And radical ecology. To my mind, this image says it all. I don't need to talk about it. Modern Western knowledge tells us that human beings are at the top of the evolution. We are the most intelligent Homo sapiens. It seems to me clear that actually we're probably the stupidest of creatures, given what we're doing to the earth and ourselves. But that's told there. Indigenous knowledge for thousands of years has told us we're one out of many species. So let's learn and relearn that humility and bring back the fact that we are, as Rita and others also said, part of nature. So one of the kind of approaches that we've taken up in India through these movements and learning from them is what we call eco-Swaraj. Now, Swaraj is a word that Mahatma Gandhi brought back from ancient India, brought into the independence movement here. But it wasn't just about India's independence from British colonial rule. It was much deeper than that. In fact, it's a very deep sense of democracy. It's almost anarchic, which is to say, I as an individual and my community assert our autonomy and our freedom and our self-determination, but in responsibility to your autonomy, your freedom, your self-determination, which means my consumption patterns or the way I behave, the way I treat a river or a lake or a forest or the air cannot undermine your ability to enjoy all the good things of life, right? And so it's a very deep sense of rights and responsibilities that you bring together. Reciprocity, which I think was it Boa? No, Rita spoke about. It's all of that that kind of comes into this notion of Swaraj, or what we call radical ecological democracy, where we assert our right to decision making, but we're also responsible to you and to the rest of nature in that assertion. There are similar notions all over the world, which many of you are familiar with, of course. Some from ancient indigenous peoples, such as from Latin America, Africa. Ubuntu, which unfortunately most young people today think is a software, is actually a philosophy of I am because we are, individual and collective balance. But also many worldviews emerging from the belly of the beast, from the industrial parts of the world, such as degrowth, ecofeminism, and many, many more. And at the end, I'll just show a book, which I think Geoffrey already mentioned, which has 100 examples of these. So finally, let me just take a couple of minutes to talk about this question of, okay, we have all these fantastic examples of alternatives. How do we make scale happen? How do we change the macro picture, which is still bearing down on us? And there's no easy answer there. I'm sure nobody really has the full answers. But I think some indications are there. Firstly, that the model of upscaling, you have a successful solution, let's upscale it, make it bigger and bigger and bigger, like Microsoft and Apple. But instead of that, or replication, we're talking about outscaling, which is to say you learn the lessons, you learn the values, and I'll get to that in a minute, and then apply them elsewhere with your own modifications, your own political, economic, ecological systems. The connection between movements of resistance and movements of constructive alternatives, either prefigurative or transfigurative or both, learning as we do. The networking that we need amongst us and different kinds of people across cultures, across sectors, across disciplines. The local to global, I put those in inverted commas because these are binaries that are sometimes problematic, but in a geographic sense, these connections that we can make across the world. Strategies for transition, because you can't achieve the revolution overnight. Strategies of transition which don't reinforce the state, but actually build more and more cracks in the state and then move towards revolution. And never forgetting that even as we do practice, we must continue to dream. But let's dream collectively and build collective visions of what different pluriverse worlds could look like. At the core of this flower of transformation is the most important part, which is the ethics of transformation. Spiritual, non-spiritual, whatever way you want to put it. I'm just putting these up. I'm not going to discuss them because we don't have the time. But to my mind, it's this which is at the core, the heart of what people are trying to do to change lives. Cooperation instead of competition, the commons instead of the private, non-violence instead of violence, simplicity instead of wanting more and more and more and more, rights not just of humans, but of the rest of nature also. It's, you know, these are the sorts of, let's say, principles or values that kind of either stated or unstated are part of these transformations. How do we make much more of this happen? How do we bring it into young people's learning processes? And this is why I say that I think what we need is not just a Green New Deal, which tells us we want electric cars instead of fossil fuel cars, but multiple revolutions which talk about social justice, justice between the global north and the global south, between people and the rest of nature, between peoples, amongst peoples, etc. And of course, sustainability. So the Rainbow Revolution. Lots of questions. Nobody has all answers to these. These are questions that we need much more work on, much more dialogue on. You know, the role of the state. Will there be a state? Should there be a state? What would be the kind of business we're talking about? What is the global governance? If United Nations has succeeded to some extent but failed also in many ways, what should be replacing it, etc. These are things that are there for ongoing dialogue. One of the processes we use in India to try and build much more of this dialogue and collaboration and a critical mass for larger change is what we call Vikalp Sangam. Geoffrey introduced it. It's the alternatives confluence, not conference, where people get together to kind of do this kind of sharing across sectors, across geographies, across cultures. And then learning from this and similar processes elsewhere, such as Crianza Mutua in Mexico and Colombia. We started this global tapestry a year and a half back to try and build horizontal, non-hierarchical tapestry, weaving together of these sorts of radical alternatives in different parts of the world, again, to be able to be more of a critical mass to affect macro change. 2 books that I'm putting up. This is a bit of self-promotion. So one on the left is 40 people in India dreaming the future in 2100, ideal futures, and then coming back to the present and saying, how do we get there? So both practice and utopian. And the one on the right is the Pluriverse book, which has 100 essays of radical alternatives around the world. Just putting these up for anybody who's interested, and stop share. Geoffrey, thank you. I hope I didn't.
It was great. Many thanks, Ashish, because it's so important for us to also have the voice of India. If we look at the global sociology, actually, we see that India has to be much more present in the ISA, and especially this kind of perspective, because what Ashish does is not only telling us what's happening in India, but building a global perspective from there. And I think he's one of the most insightful researcher and activists to do it. Thank you very much for that, Ashish.
Thank you.
Now I'll pass the floor to Jean-Louis Laville, a socialist based in Paris. He's involved in numerous international networks and has authored and co-edited books in French, English, Portuguese, Italian, and Spanish, notably, and notably on solidarity economy and critical sociology. And what's also what is at the core of his perspective is a permanent dialogue with the global south. His main book in English are The Human Economy, a Citizen Guide, Theory of Social Enterprise and Pluralism, Social Movement, Solidarity Economy, and the Global South, which is directly connected to what Ashish just told us about. And he has a forthcoming book at University of Minnesota Press entitled The Social and Solidarity Economy, Practices, Theories, and Debates. Jean-Louis, the floor is yours for some 20 minutes.
Thank you, Geoffrey. First, I want to thank our 2 presidents. For Sari, I think it's important that you mentioned from the beginning that we have to choose as sociologists the civil society, but not an isolated civil society, but a civil society which is both in conflict and cooperation with market and state. And I think that you indicate an hybridization way of thinking, which is very important for the following steps. Because all the person says this, and we are now in hard times. Market fundamentalism in many countries is now mixed with technocratic and authoritarian tendencies. And I think that we have to thank also Geoffrey for including the presence of Marielle for beginning this panel, and also for mentioning that there are important epistemic challenges. And I will try to speak a little bit about these epistemic challenges following Geoffrey. In coherence with what was just said, I would like to underline how South-North dialogue seems to be constitutive of the new revisited critical sociology. Because I agree with Boaventura, and it was clearly said also by the colleagues, we need a critical sociology, but a different critical sociology. And I think there is no exit in Northern usual critical sociology. The only exit passes by a new global sociology, and I will try to argue about this. Let's go back first to the roots of critical theory. When Marx used the expression, he was arguing for an analysis of the existing social order linked to the perspective of emancipation. The Frankfurt School expanded this analysis. It evidenced the dialectics of the reason, starting from a belief on human progress and implementing step by step instrumental and strategic behaviors. As developed by Bourdieu, the critical sociology has continued to study how economic exploitation is reinforced by cultural alienation. In spite of their consistency, this contribution focused on the reproduction of social order, the emancipation becoming inaccessible. With Bourdieu especially, the actor is identified with a powerlessness agent, victim of unconscious determination, and this theory has led to an intensification of the differences between sociological science and ordinary people, opposing the truth revealed by the science to the illusions of the common sense. In short, critical sociology has been oriented to a negative criticism, largely inherited from Hegel. It is necessary, but it's no longer sufficient in a period where it was said before, the way to liberation has to be reframed in a world full of injustice and in danger of falling to pieces because of the anthropocenic consequences. It seems clear we have to go beyond the limits of Occidentalo-critic sociology in order to define another critical sociology adjusted to contemporary challenges. That is why the South-North dialogue is so important. Having the pleasure to be together in this opening session with Boaventura, I am happy to use his synthesis about South epistemologies to focus on 5 points, emphasizing what Southern approaches bring to a global sociology already. First, South epistemologies question modern science based on the subject-object divide. They are in favor of a sociology of emergencies, extending the present by adding to existing reality future possibilities and the hope that these possibilities encourage. On this topic, South epistemologies largely converge with pragmatism, when emblematic author of this current, Latour, also wants to transform the object in a matter of concern rather than a matter of facts. He wants to describe how what we call facts are the results of very complex arrangement. So the critical sociology in that sense is no more a negative one, it's inherited from Hegel, but a constructive one, attentive to the building processes of reality. But, and it's the second point, both epistemologies, South epistemologies had to North pragmatism, a sociology of absences, aiming to show that what doesn't exist is produced as non-existent, as a non-credible alternative to what is supposed to exist. By combining sociology of emergencies and absences, South epistemologies help to mix negative and constructive criticism, what is crucial. And that's the third point. By holding together these two sides, South epistemologies demonstrate how exclusively negative criticism contains an implicit elitism obvious in some segment of traditional Northern critical theory. We can recollect, for instance, Adorno's amazing contempt of jazz music, or we can remember how local feminism and Black feminism have also insisted on the way analytical frameworks imported from the North keep non-Occidental women in confinement, ignoring their own ways of facing oppression. Like standpoint theory shows, there is no more legitimacy for panoptic Northern knowledge, and sociology has not the monopoly of social meanings. Consequently, common sense has not to be condemned, but rather approached through its ambivalences, with its tendency to conservatism, but also with its intelligence of horizontal complex relations. Observations are not to be separated from experiences, as Southern participative action research exemplified. Once again, encountering pragmatism, such as Dewey, social surveys undertaken by self-organization of the people concerned. So that's the first point. Considering ambivalences and caring about social practices allows to demarcate from a rupture paradigm so present in the revolutionary rhetoric of the 20th century. The concept of emancipation has to escape from a Promethean definition and from the quest for purity deeply anchored in Occidental thinking. It has to be re-elaborated by taking in account interdependencies between human and non-human beings. These interdependencies have not to be omitted, but restructured by more egalitarian relation. Emancipation has to be embedded in sustainability, like it was already conceptualized by Aristotle's good life, Polanyi's livelihood, feminist reproduction, and buen vivir ideas. So that's the fifth point. Northern critical theory has also been too much centered on discourse and rationality. It has privileged the repertory of protest, as noted by Nancy Fraser or Iris Marion Young in their defense of subaltern group expressions. The research realized by Geoffrey in the pandemic period also lays stress upon the logics of daily solidarity and self-help that have not to be neglected. It's decisive to grasp all the forms of mobilization, the spectacular ones, but also the more modest, overflowing the cultural turn identified in the social movement sociology. It's not an accident if the solidarity economy, despite by so many European thinkers, is much more taken seriously as a social movement in South America. If we listen to Quijano, it's even possible to pretend that it's participating to a movement of society like said Rita, against the modern rules of actions and knowledge. In other words, there are a lot of social and ecological alternatives, struggling against the alienating part of modernity and radicalizing the emancipatory part of the same modernity. In these fights for a real ecologic and solidarian transition, it's really important to give a new status to real utopias, according to Eric Olling Wright, or to promote public sociology, according to Michael Boravoy. Referring to the 5 points just mentioned, I am sure that the South-North dialogue and the translation among different critical knowledges and practices are powerful heuristic tools for going in this direction. I just want to finish by mentioning how I realize personally this potential of the South-North dialogue. I want to show that it's step by step and that el camino se hace caminando. It began when we initiated a collective work with some South American and European colleagues, starting from a first book, Outra Economia, coordinating by Antonio David Catani from the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul here in Porto Alegre. We decided to mutualize a practical and theoretical proposal for diverse economies, considering that they are not a dream, but an hidden reality made invisible by mainstream economics from the second half of the 19th century. We didn't realize the usual comparative research, but we gathered information in the two continents and talk about them in a comprehensive way to write a list of entries contextualized in each of the 5 versions of the Dictionary of Other Economy published in the two continents. We then enlarged the groups of people involved by integrating African, North American, and Asian colleagues for a very modified version in English titled The Human Economy. And it made us sensitive to the problems of translation. Just to take an example, solidarity is a key notion in Latin languages, but it's not so used in English. And it created the wish to deepen the discussion about solidarity, contrasting democratic and philanthropic solidarity in further works. We continue this South-North collaborative construction with José Luis Coraggio from Argentina, with 2 other books about the lefts for the 21st century, with a contribution from Rita, and social movements and solidarity economy. In this writing, we also understood better how some thematics like social enterprise were conceptualized in US and Europe, limiting the southern countries to the provision of case studies. So it was necessary to react against this colonialism by a promotion of global South thinking, and that was the core of a more inclusive approach in the book Social Enterprise and Pluralism. Here are just a few illustrations of this conversation, but I find it very rich in a word uniformized and standardized by neoliberalism. We need socio-diversity as we need biodiversity. I am sure that in spite of travel limits, our forum will contribute to such a socio-diversity. That is why I'm very happy and honored to participate in this opening session organized by Geoffrey according to this principle of South and North conversation.
Thank you. Many thanks, Jean-Louis, and thanks to all the participants, all the speakers who had a very focused presentation, and we still have sometimes about a bit more than half an hour for debate and questions. There are actually some very important questions in a Q&A already, notably concerning the methods So one of the questions is directly addressed to Boaventura, but I think that it's actually addressed to everyone who would particularly be interested in listening to Rita answer to this question too. But oops, sorry, there is a question here. I read it. What epistemologies?
Geoffrey,
Yes.
you may remind those who watch off live stream in Facebook, they can also put their questions there and will be collected and discussed. Yeah.
Excellent, Sari. Thank you for this very important reminder. So yes, please go ahead with your question. We'll try to collect it, and also would like already to invite the speakers also to reflect on the other speakers' talks. And I think that there were some convergences among all the four keynote speakers, and to be also dialogue among you. And so one of the important questions, all the questions are important, but here the question of methodology. What methodologies do you propose for the third scenario for BOA? And also think that I know that Rita has also worked on that, and too. And another important question, and here particularly for our colleague from Latin America and India, Ashish and Rita, but also BOA and Jean-Louis have worked on that. How do Southern scholars develop deep, important theory in a bath already filled with Northern theory? That's a question by Shannon Schwartz, the president of RC34 on youth, on sociology of youth. It's not, it's not about throwing the baby out with a bathwater. It's about creating space to fill our own bath. So that's also a very important question about the production and the domination of knowledge. So we will collect other questions. Here we are. Sometimes, Sari, have you seen other questions that you want to take from Facebook or other means? No? Sorry?
I was not looking, but I will now. I thought you are doing it. So don't worry, I will do it. Okay. If you allow Boaventura to start, and maybe I will help you in collecting questions.
Excellent. So we have this first question, but addressed mostly to Boaventura and Rita, but other two speakers too. So Boaventura, the floor is yours.
Well, I think the question is the one on methodologies, right?
Yes.
So yeah.
What methodology for the perspective you propose, and especially?
Yeah, well, I have yes, I've been thank you for the question. The epistemology of the South, in fact, is a question of occupation of epistemology, because it's based on the idea that our knowledges that are not separate from other practices, because only our academic knowledge seems to be separated the way we produce it. But if we take as a premise of your work that all the other knowledges should be brought into the conversation, and if we don't have to have the idea of the anything goes, that is to say, absolute relativism among knowledges, we have to know which side are we on and what are the methodologies by which we can access those types of knowledges. That's why I think that the key concept in the epistemology of the South, this attempt to validate knowledges born in struggle, the ones, the popular knowledges, and very often also scientific knowledge together, the key concept is the concept of the struggle. Because my experience, in fact, has told me that is in struggle that we find these what I call the ecologies of knowledges. For instance, I've been very much involved in the movement against agrotoxics in agriculture, in industrial agriculture. And this takes place in Europe, in Latin America, and in Asia as well. I've been much more involved in the European and Latin American side of it. And I can see that in our struggle, we combine scientific knowledge, of course, not the Monsanto biologists or chemists, but the people that are with us in the struggle, chemists, biologists, and so on, engineers, and the popular knowledge of the peasants that know very well how the poisonous is being brought into their lungs, into their lives, into their community by the air pulverization of insecticides and pesticides. So we combine, as we combine struggles, we also combine knowledges. The idea of combining knowledge to the extent that they can be enriched, it's very important. Then, so the question is, how do you get to the other knowledges? Since you are supposed to do what we are doing here, instead of reporting about popular knowledges, but not staying with them, experiencing them at this point, right? So I think that I have developed the idea that we cannot really go on by knowing about, but we should go from now on knowing with and knowing from. This is very difficult to do that in our departments, in our research proposals. If you want to present, I have by experience all my difficulties in promoting this ecology of knowledge into a kind of a research project. But we have to do is countercurrent. So knowing with forces us to do collaborative work and collaborative methodologies. The methodologies that we call are not extractivist, because we usually speak about the extractivism of companies, mining, and so on. But in fact, we do the same in sociology and the social sciences when we do our interviews, when we, our reports, even oral histories, because for many of us, we are not getting access to knowledge. We are getting access to information. Knowledge is our knowledge. So I think that we have to see that on the other side, there is knowledge. And I start from the assumption that all knowledges are incomplete. So I know that the more I develop scientific knowledge, the more I become ignorant of other knowledges, other things that I can't know. For instance, we have been discussing recently in our intercultural circles, for instance, the question of spirituality. It's very easy for one to see the idea that a river is sacred, but to have the lived experience of the spirituality coming from a river, we have to come with a different conception of ontology, as Ashish was saying. So there are not just epistemologies, are ontologies here. There are very different ways of being. And the Ubuntu hypothesis is one of them, and there are many others that have been already mentioned in our conversations. How do we get access to that? We have to be in the struggle. So I say that the epistemology of the South will be a ruin if they become just a theme for a course, or even a department on epistemology of the South. Not at all. You have to be in the struggles. I spend 50% of my time at university and 50% of my time with social movements, even now online, because lots of social movements are resorting to these means to conduct struggles, to have conversation, to discuss their problems. And you can't imagine how rich the experience is if we are talking with squatter settlements in Sao Paulo, or here in Portugal, or you are doing that in Zavaleta in Buenos Aires, or in the Cauca region of Colombia, or in Zapotecs, or in Mexico, in Michoacan. So we have lots of different experiences, and these experiences are really creating a knowledge. So in my most recent book, The End of Cognitive Empire, I never have this access, this online to send you immediately. But if you go to the Google, you'll see the online even version of my books and access. You can see I have 2 chapters on methodologies, what we have been calling these collaborative methodologies. And I have a different conception of knowledge because it is the corporeality of knowledge, as Rita also mentioned, because the bodies are the ones much beyond Merleau-Ponty. We think they are bodies, both individual and collective. The idea of the territories of the land, all of them are part of our ideas of corporeality. And that's why we have to exercise many other senses that we don't. In our science, we just exercise vision and ear, but not listening to. We don't know how to deep listen. How much of you, how much I in the past did that when I was doing interviewing, and many people would start talking to me about things that were not relevant for my research. Well, I said, well, I'm sorry, this is not relevant. I mean, it's very authoritarian when we, in sociology, in our methodology textbooks say, please select between the relevant and non-relevant issues. In fact, we should, but not in the context in which we are collaborating with other ways of knowing, because other people may be concerned about very different ways and different problems. And this is the plurality. I think that the main message of this plenary session, and I'm very happy with that, is that all of us, in a sense, have been from different perspectives, from different disquietudes that we have with learning. We have been really making a plea for the plurality of livings, but also the plurality of epistemologies, the plurality of methodologies, and the plurality of ontologies. I mean, this idea of plurality is very fundamental, and I think that we should keep in it. But I don't know if I can just have one more minute to go beyond methodology, because if I have, I'll do. If not, I'll do in the next section, because I think the question I'd like to address is this. Domination, in fact, is global. We have seen all the celebration of diversity, but we know also that the dominant classes and castes and so on, they play with our plurality. They take hold of it, and they sometimes capture it. How do you confront that? So I think this is a serious issue that should raise us. I agree with Ashish, and we have been discussing the outscaling, but don't forget downscaling, upscaling, and transforming the scale, what I call the trans-scaling. That's probably the solution. Thank you, Geoffrey.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Bora. I will know before moving to Rita that we are setting up a translation, a live translation again. So Rita, if you can just wait a bit, we will first move to Rita's work a lot on these methodological questions. But we first listen to Ashish, who also had questions, and then if it's okay for you, Rita, we will come back to you. Is that okay? Así que vamos a escuchar a Ashish un momento y luego te doy la palabra para traducción en español y en inglés al mismo tiempo, pero primero vamos a escuchar a Ashish. So Ashish, you had a question, if you could just summarize it and then answer to it, please.
Sure, I think the question directly addressed to me was on from Ines Duran Matute. He says, as you said, Swaraj seems to have a broader meaning than that of democracy. How do we feel about this translation? I feel that sometimes we interpret alternatives with the same hegemonic rationality and grammar, and in some way we subordinate our creativity to build a world in which many worlds fit. What do you think? So my response to that, Ines, is that I agree. I think one of the problems is whether we're from a corporate world or government world or from civil society and social science and so on, there is a tendency to be reductionist. And so thinking of, let's say, an indigenous way of governing the nation, it's the indigenous nation, or Swaraj in India or many others, as forms of democracy is a way of reductionism in that sense, right? And I think it's very important that we actually look at what are the principles of this form of governance. And there would be similarities with say, Western democracy, but there'll also be crucial differences, as I tried to point out with Swaraj. So we have to find ways in this collaboration, in this solidarity, in some of, for instance, what Boa is saying about epistemologies of the South or epistemologies of the South and the North together, to see how do we continue to respect this kind of diversity even as we build the bridges amongst all of us, and not get tempted by thinking of everything as in one term. This is true. And one of the interesting things that's happening now is that people in India are beginning to say, oh, we also have buen vivir. So we're no longer, of course, some of us are still saying democracy, etc., because that's come from Europe or America or wherever. But now, because BoavenVivir has also become very popular in Europe, so from there it's kind of coming here and saying, oh, we also have BoavenVivir, and forgetting the fact that we have 50 other terms for the ways in which we have been doing self-governance, including Swaraj. So there's many different ways in which this kind of, colonization works in multiple different ways, sometimes very subtle. Just a quick word on methodology, Geoffrey, if that's okay. I think, this question of the bathwater is absolutely crucial, and Boa has already kind of given a response to it. I just wanted to add a couple of things. One is the importance of slow knowledge. And in today's world, especially with so-called social media, everything is so fast that we have forgotten the traditions or ignored the traditions of slow knowledge, of trying to understand something over 10 years rather than 10 days or 10 minutes. And that is very important, because when we go and work in a community, especially an indigenous community or a fishing community or whatever, their pace of life is very different from what we might want as an urban intellectual coming in and wanting to study it. And rather than force that pace of life, because we have a 3-year period or a 2-month period or whatever it is, we have to contain our impatience and say, we need to get to that pace of understanding, which is a generation, which is 10 years, which is, or many generations. So slow knowledge, how do we bring that back into our systems? And then breaking the walls between the formal and the informal. The institutional structures that we have built for learning and education and transmission of knowledge and all of that, and the informal or non-formal ways of learning that is there, still there in many of our societies, breaking the walls. So one of the things I've been challenging universities in India is, don't think of teachers and professors as only the ones who have PhDs. A so-called illiterate indigenous person in central India, or a Dalit woman farmer, the example I gave you of, who might not know how to read and write, but would be as fantastic a teacher to your students as a PhD, somebody who's done a PhD. How do we break these boundaries? How do we create, for instance, PhDs, which are 10 people authored and not just one? Because after all, the person who's done that PhD and written it has taken ideas from lots of people, gone to a community, spent 3 years there, and taken all those ideas and put it into PhD, and it becomes one name. Why? Why can't it be the entire community getting a PhD? Or whatever other form of recognition that we want. So I think these are also things that we have to really break through, and of course it'll take time, but we have to take up those challenges. Thanks, Geoffrey.
Thank you very much, Ashish. Now we have almost.
Listen, you can tell my question in English, no problem. Where is the question?
Okay. Oh, well, that's perfect. If not, I think that Carminda is able to translate. So she's there and she's on the right channel. So it seems that we will not have any translation problems. Is that right, Carminda? She's just replying to direct message there. I thank her very much. So Carminda is a sociologist, and she's also the organizer of the World Social Forum. So that's why she knows everything about techniques and Zooms. And so are you translating now, Carminda?
That the microphone, Carminda's microphone is off.
Okay, so can anyone tell me if the... vamos a hablar en español para que sea el canal en español entonces, y el otro será en inglés. Si alguien me puede confirmar eso para evitar que hablamos ahí como antes. So that there will be again one channel in English and the other one in Spanish. Is that okay? Is that okay? It seems to be okay. Thank you, Pilar. Just replied. Thank you very much. So, Rita, gracias a Carminda, puedes hablar en español y estamos todos muy contentos de escucharte en español. Por favor, creo que... Rita?
Sí, pero no tengo la pregunta. I don't have
la pregunta era sobre la metodología. Así que la pregunta era de ver cómo esa perspectiva se pone también en prácticas metodológicas. pregunta que sí, pues trabajas en muchos.
Bueno, we the anthropologists are not very good at methodology. It's not our main, it's a hearing, como la escucha etnográfica is the method of anthropology, so ethnographic hearing. But what I believe is that what we have in common here is to put the question on power. I mean, the struggle and the participation in the struggle is very important. But for me, the main question that divides different perspectives is the question on where is power in the scene, with suspicion, as Rickers and others would define suspecting perspectives, and suspicion about how power works from behind the screen. So I mean, I make a difference between the way I approach this question is separating from what we call the pamphletarian Weberian interpretation that speaks about objectivity and neutrality. And I believe that there is a confusion when some professors teach neutrality, because I believe that in the social sciences, there are two steps. The first step is the question, and the question is never neutral. So when you put the question, when you put your curiosity, what are you going to ask the field, to ask the context you are going to observe? There is no neutrality in it, but there is a choice, because you choose your question. There is a choice of question. And in the second moment, you have neutrality. How do you answer your question? And in the answering, you have to look at the word in the very neutral and objective way. So I think there is a confusion, a methodological confusion between these two steps. The step of the question, which is always interested, and different perspectives, different methodological perspectives, different theories. How do you choose a theory? You choose a theory when you are very young. You choose a theory because you have a good professor or a professor with resources for your research. So, but when you are mature, you choose a theory for where that theory leads you to. I mean, where that theory leads you, which are the targets, the interests that theory leads you. So you put a question from your theoretical perspective, which is a choice in between different theoretical perspectives. Mine is a theoretical perspective that puts a question on power. Where is power and how power is acting in reality? And then you have the second step, which is the observation of the field, the observation of your context to answer the theoretical problem and the interested question. And then you have to be neutral in the observation. This is my approach to method.
Thank you, Rita. There is also another question here for you in español. Si pudiera profundizar sobre las contradicciones, en especial de la ciudadanía. And Rita, if you agree, I will just leave you this question in 2 minutes. We will listen to Jean-Louis Laville, and then immediately, and then afterwards, I come back to you with this question. So in English, the question for Rita is to deepen a bit what she explained about contradictions, especially the contradiction of citizenship. So she will reply after just in 2 minutes. Now I leave the floor to Jean-Louis Laville for a brief reply to.
Yeah, just to add a few words. I think that we have also to be open to uncertainty, because there are some learning processes that we don't control. I will take just the example of the question raised by Rita about the absence of reciprocity in French Revolution. it was a strong question that we received when we worked in South America as European. And after we had meetings with historians from France, from Italy, from Denmark, from Spain, and we tried to reconsider the history through this question of the absence of reciprocity. And we discovered that reciprocity was present in the worker and peasant movement in some countries in Europe, but it was invisibilized in history which was rebuilt in the second 19th century, as Hobsbawm would say, with an history of a centralized movement, but as a pioneering worker movement was not absolutely not centralized. So there was a dimension of reciprocity. And without this question raising from South America, we didn't discover this reality in our history. So I think that we have processes also of uncontrolled learning processes. And it's important also in the methodology to hear something which is surprising because it's coming from another cultural arena. And sometimes we are discovering something that we didn't know from our own history through this uncertainty.
Thank you very much, Jean-Louis. So now over again to Rita on this question of the contradictions, and particularly the contradiction in the field of citizenship.
Yes, it comes, that contradiction between peoples and citizenship comes from something I learned from the field, from people with whom I worked, which is a distrust of the state. Citizenship is constituted in relationship with a nation state, and people in the field, real people, distrust the state. Okay? When the state has something to offer, people come out and take what the state is offering. But for the everyday life, most of the people in our countries, and probably in other colonized countries too, continue to be stateless societies. So citizenship is a fiction, it's not real for most people, at least for most people I met in the field. So people, different peoples are real. Los pueblos son reales, with their own way of making justice, solving conflicts, getting to survive. And in Latin America, it's very interesting that many of these peoples, these other peoples, went into clandestinity when the republics started. This is a very particular and revealing phenomenon. When our republics started as national states, many of the indigenous peoples went into clandestinity for 200 years. And now we are starting to understand that. So I think there is a tension and an important difference in between citizenship and the way of life and the historical path of peoples. So I believe in our territories we have a plurality of histories, which is very relevant to realize and identify. I don't know if I have answered the whole question, because it is really, it would take a longer explanation, but I think that is enough to understand what I mean.
You definitely have opened, you have very well answered the question and opened many questions. So to make sure that we will have to invite you many times at ISA, but I just take a minute to say that Rita will also be a panelist in a discussion tomorrow in the Claxo plenary. So if you want to listen to her, she will also take part in this session tomorrow about the same time. And just now we have the final short question by our ISA president, Sari Hanafi. Short question for Boaventura or SANTOS.
Yeah, thank you. First, I would like really to say how much I enjoy Rita, Jean-Louis, Ashish, in addition of Boaventura talks, and really this is a lot of food for thought I will take with me. Boaventura, I love your book, and you know that I review it, and it will be in among 3-4 scholars who we gather a different thought about the book. And in my book review, I focus on the reception, and I said, look, where your thesis is amazingly convincing, generally speaking. Unfortunately, in some area, I will talk about the Arab world, how when they hear that they have their own epistemology, this enhance more sharp dichotomies between East and West, between science and religion, between reason and emotion, and so on. And this is what and all the movement of Islamization of knowledge, which is now so happy with this idea of that each area they have own epistemology, which is not your analysis, of course, like this, but I mean how it is interpreted. But just to say something that more and more in France, I see a serious problem. I mean, if I take and your talk is so relevant for a country like France. If I take the conception of secularism, how religion is conceived as a matter of conscience, so you can easily be privatized to the school, to home and private place. So they don't understand religion as a ritual. So they don't understand the woman veil as inherent part of their Islamic ritual. Whether we like it, we don't like it, is another issue. But I mean, so the way we define religion in France is so exclusionary, it's so Christian. So the novel laicity in France is a very Christian one. And really, I don't mind to have the Christian worldview to be universalized if there is a good for the humanity. But again, waiting for that, I mean, there is other worldviews and how they force the Muslim community to abide to this tough secularism is terrible. So I see your book, Epistemology of South, so relevant for specifically some countries like France. I stop here.
And thank you, Sari. And now we'll ask Boaventura a challenge to answer in really only 2 minutes, because there are 31 sessions starting just afterwards. And we also have to respect the work. We had time here for this session. Sorry about that, Boaventura, but you have very little time to answer this important question. I'm sure it's only starting a debate with Sari that will take much more time. Boy, we don't hear you. No. Okay.
Can I speak? Because I thought that you were telling me that I don't have time.
You have 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Well, it's easy. Well, Sari, you know that I'm a good reader of Ibn Khaldun, an author that I'm sure you know very well from Muqaddimah. Yeah. So Ibn Khaldun distinguishes between the revelation science and the observation sciences.
Exactly.
And I think, you know, this is much more productive than probably between science and other knowledges, because we captured, in fact, and reduced the concept of modern science in the 17th century, because the fight was against philosophy and theology. I think now, there is so much internal plurality in the science that I've been pleading for external plurality, but in fact without relativism. And that's why I think that when I was listening to Rita, in my work at least, what I do is to distinguish between objectivity and neutrality. because we have to be objective to handle the methodologies that are available to us, to have the different sides of different reality. Neutrality is a different thing. It's which side are you on in a struggle? And if you say that you are not on the side of any because you are neutral, you are siding with the oppressor without knowing it. So I think it's just a distinction that we have to make. And I think that at this point, what I call, and Sari, I understand you very well, is that, well, we know that even, as Hashim Bem says, I mean, colonialism is co-creation. We know the East and West. If we look at Jack Good at Eurasia, you see the West and the East together there. So it's a long conversation, but I'm glad that our way of pluralizing the universe, biodiversity, demodiversity, social diversity, epistemological, ecological diversity is really being useful for a society so much concerned with some universal ideas, supposedly, like the French society. So I'm glad that our work may be relevant. The problem is for the French to read us, because they usually don't read as much. So we have to, I would like that reader would be more available in France, myself, and many of us. But it's difficult to get in.
Let's have another discussion about the future of French society together.
This will definitely be for important discussion from one of the further panel, and this was really a fantastic space of global sociology rooted in a dialogue in a pluriverse. I would like to thank very much Rita, Boa, Jean-Louis, Ashish for this fantastic dialogue, our President Sari Hanafi also for opening this session, and Jacob, Lima, and the Brazilian Sociological Society. It will actually, the Brazilian Sociological Society will organize a plenary every day, on the first three days of this forum. At the same time, also Claxo and Alas, we also organize some plenary. So this session is just the beginning. It's not the end of the debate. The debate will go on for years and years, no doubt, and we still we see that we are going forward in a more diverse sociology, where the goal is us to have more space. We will carry on this discussion of more than 800 panels in the next 6 days that have been very well prepared by hundreds of colleagues. And the first one, actually 31 session, will start in just 15 minutes. Please have a look at the program and join one of these sessions. Then we have 32 sessions again after that, starting in Europe at 9:30 in the evening. That means 7:30 in Brazil, if I'm not wrong, today. And also an excellent virtual pub session after that, organized by us 34. So because unfortunately we cannot have a drink after that, this will be very much missing. And also please join us to carry on this debate in the closing sessions with speakers from Mozambique and the Arab world and the US to carry on this world tour of different global sociology. Certainly, Shami, the president of the Arab Council of Sociology, will be with us, of social sciences. Isabel Casimiro, the president of the African Council of Social Sciences, will also be with us, and Michael Borwell, the former president of ISA, will also be with us talking about the voice. So please join us at this final closing plenary and in every other plenaries and in panels before that. And thank you very much for this fantastic session. Thanks about the gratitude for external speakers. And now we'll leave the floor over for the next session. Please join us at many other sessions in this forum.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.